She had nothing left. No ranch, no savings, no name that meant anything in this territory anymore. Just a trunk, a box of books, and 6 years of experience that nobody had asked for yet. Most women in her position would have taken the first offer that came along, something small and safe, something that didn't require negotiating with the most powerful rancher in the region. Evelyn Carter was not most women. She rode out to Blackstone Ranch with a list of conditions in her coat pocket and a refusal to be intimidated by a man whose reputation alone had driven 3 previous candidates to decline the interview. Cole Barrett had built an empire on 11,000 acres of the hardest land in the territory. But his empire was quietly falling apart. The books were a mess, the operations were drifting, and the grief he'd been carrying since his wife died 2 years ago had left the whole place running on momentum alone. He needed her more than she needed him, and she knew it, even if he didn't yet. What neither of them knew was that something far more dangerous than disorder was already moving toward Blackstone Ranch. A ruthless rival who saw a grieving man in a vulnerable empire and decided the timing was perfect. He was wrong about the timing. He hadn't counted on her. Like this video and comment the name of your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, in Evelyn Carter's experience, the worst possible day for bad news. Mondays at least had the decency to be predictable, but Tuesday had a way of catching a person mid-stride, right when they thought the week might go somewhere decent. She read it twice standing in the post office doorway, the morning sun already hard and flat against the dust of Denton Creek's main street. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and walked back to the boarding house where she had been renting a room for 11 days, which was exactly how long it had been since the Rourke family had let her go. It hadn't been her fault. That was the thing she kept turning over, not because she needed the reassurance, but because the facts mattered to her. And the fact was that Hector Rourke had driven his cattle operation into the ground through 3 consecutive seasons of bad decisions. And when the creditors finally arrived, he'd dismissed his entire staff with 2 weeks' pay and a handshake that she hadn't taken. She hadn't taken it because she'd been too angry, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But anger didn't pay for a room. And the letter in her pocket was an answer to the notice she'd posted at the general store 9 days ago. 2 lines on a card, nothing ornate. Experienced ranch manager, 6 years, seeks position. References available. E. Carter. The letter was from Blackstone Ranch. She sat on the edge of her bed and read it a 3rd time. The handwriting was plain and slightly cramped, like someone who wrote quickly and didn't much care whether it looked elegant. It said that Mr. Cole Barrett was seeking a qualified ranch manager to oversee daily operations, that the previous manager had departed in September, that the position included room, board, and competitive wages, and that if she was interested, she should present herself at the ranch office no later than Thursday of this week. It didn't say please. It didn't say thank you for your inquiry. It was the kind of letter a man wrote when he expected people to come to him, and wasn't particularly worried about whether they did. She knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Blackstone Ranch sat on 11,000 acres of the best grazing land in the region, running upward of 3,000 head of cattle and employing close to 40 men through peak season. Cole Barrett had built most of it himself after inheriting a modest spread from his father, and he'd built it the way people built things out here, by working longer than everyone else and making fewer mistakes, and sometimes making the right mistake at exactly the right moment. He was somewhere around 40, she thought. His wife had died 2 years back. She didn't know much more than that, and she hadn't tried to find out because none of it was her business until it was. Thursday was 2 days away. She spent Wednesday doing 3 things: reviewing her own records, writing a list of questions she intended to ask, and pressing her best work shirt until the collar sat flat. She was not someone who arrived anywhere unprepared. That had been true since she was 19 and had talked her way into her first ranch position by knowing more about rotational grazing patterns than the man who'd been doing the job for a decade. Preparation wasn't armor, exactly. It was more like knowing the terrain before you crossed it. The ride out to Blackstone Ranch took 40 minutes on a borrowed horse, and she used the time to look at the land rather than rehearse anything. Land told you things before people did. The grass along the road was clipped short and well-managed, the fence lines tight and recently repaired, the water channels running clean. Someone out here knew what they were doing, or had known, once. The absence of the previous manager had a shape to it, visible in small ways. A gate hinge that needed oil, a section of drainage ditch that had silted up at one end. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of small neglect that accumulated when attention was directed elsewhere. The main house came into view around a low ridge, 2 stories of dark timber and stone, wide porches on both levels. The whole thing sitting back from a yard that was orderly but not particularly welcoming. The bunkhouse and outbuildings were set at a practical distance. A windmill turned slowly against the white sky. She tied the horse at the post near the office, which was a separate low building adjacent to the main house, and knocked twice on the doorframe. "It's open." The man behind the desk was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. Cole Barrett was broad across the shoulders, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that wasn't quite handsome but was very much present. He was reading something when she came in, and he didn't look up immediately, which she clocked as either rudeness or just a man finishing his thought. She waited. He set the paper down and looked at her. His eyes were dark and direct, and he took about 3 seconds to assess her in the way that people who'd spent decades reading livestock and weather learned to read everything, quickly and without sentiment. "Miss Carter." "Mr. Barrett." "Sit down." She sat. She did not fold her hands in her lap like someone hoping to be liked. He looked at the card she'd sent along with her letter of inquiry, which was now on the desk in front of him. 6 years. 6 years managing, yes. 2 years before that working general ranch hand positions. Started when I was 18. Where? First 3 years at Callaway Ranch, outside Millhaven. Then 2 years at the Denton Spread, south of here. Smaller operation, about 600 head. Most recently 4 years at Rourke's. Rourke closed up. He did. Why? She met his eyes. Because he bought 400 head he couldn't afford to feed through a bad winter, didn't adjust his grazing rotation when the south pasture dried out, and then borrowed against next season's profit to cover losses from the season before. When the calving numbers came in low 2 years running, the math stopped working. Barrett studied her for a moment. You told him all that. I told him the first part before he bought the cattle. I told him the second part when the south pasture started showing stress. By the third part, telling him anything had stopped being useful. So you left. He let me go. When the creditors arrived, he dismissed his staff. And before that, you stayed. I stayed because the work needed to be done, and the cattle didn't have anything to do with his decisions. She paused. And because I thought he might listen eventually. I was wrong about that. Barrett picked up his coffee mug, discovered it was empty, and set it back down with the mild irritation of someone who'd meant to refill it an hour ago. I've got 42 men on the payroll right now, dropping to about 30 through winter. 3,080 head, 11 sections of fence line, 2 seasonal creek crossings that need reinforcement before spring, and a hay inventory that I'd call adequate if I was feeling generous, which I'm not. He looked at her steadily. My last manager was here 8 years. He retired to live near his daughter in Colorado. Before he left, he told me he'd run the place so long he'd stopped writing things down because he kept it all in his head. That's a problem. That's a significant problem, yes. I've spent the past 6 weeks trying to reconstruct supply records and maintenance schedules from memory and incomplete ledgers. His jaw shifted slightly. I don't have time to train someone slowly. I need someone who can walk in, understand what's in front of them, and start making decisions. Evelyn nodded. What's the wage? He named a figure. It was fair. Not generous, but fair. And she'd learned to distinguish between the two because some men use generosity to buy compliance, and she didn't want to be bought. Fair wages meant a working relationship, which was what she wanted. I have 3 conditions, she said. Something flickered in his expression. Not offense exactly, more like surprise, recalibrated quickly into something neutral. Go on. I make operational decisions independently within the scope of my role. I'll report to you and I'll consult you on anything that involves significant expense or changes to the overall operation. But I don't need approval for day-to-day management choices. If you don't trust the person you've hired enough to let them work, you've hired the wrong person. He didn't say anything. She continued. Second, I need complete access to whatever records exist. Financial, inventory, maintenance, anything that touches the ranch's operation, including the incomplete ones, especially the incomplete ones. And the third, If I see something going wrong, I'll say so directly. I won't soften it, and I won't wait to see if it fixes itself. That may not always be comfortable. Barrett looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a horse moved somewhere in the yard, and a man's voice called something to another man, and the windmill turned. "You've had this conversation before," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "I've learned that it's better to have it at the beginning." He was quiet another moment. Then he said, "My wife used to say I was difficult to work with because I forgot that other people couldn't see what was in my head." He said it flatly, without particular emotion, like he was reporting a fact about a piece of equipment. She was right. "I know that. I don't always remember it." Evelyn said nothing. She understood that he wasn't asking for anything. He was giving her information, and it was more useful than most of what a man might have said in that chair. "All right," he said. "Your conditions are acceptable. When can you start?" "Tomorrow," she said. She moved her things out to the ranch that afternoon, which meant a trunk, a saddlebag, and a wooden box of books that the boarding house owner helped her load onto a wagon without asking questions. Her room was in the house itself, the east wing, 2 rooms that had clearly been used for storage at some point and converted, not recently, into modest but functional living quarters. The window looked out over the kitchen garden, which was in poor shape but had good soil. She noted that without commenting on it. Dinner that first night was eaten in the kitchen with the housekeeper, a sturdy woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who had been with the ranch for 12 years and who regarded Evelyn with the careful skepticism of someone who had seen managers come and go. She served beef stew and cornbread and poured coffee without asking, and Evelyn ate without performing gratitude, which seemed to be the right call, because Mrs. Aldridge relaxed fractionally by the end of the meal. "The last one," Mrs. Aldridge said, refilling the coffee. "Mr. Holt. He was a good man, knew this ranch like the back of his hand. I heard. He kept a lot in his head." "So I was told." Mrs. Aldridge sat down across from her, which she hadn't done for most of the meal. "You're younger than I expected." "I get that." "The men are going to test you." "I expect they will." The housekeeper studied her. "You don't seem worried about it." Evelyn picked up her coffee. "Being worried about it doesn't change it. Knowing what I'm doing does." She looked at Mrs. Aldridge over the rim of the mug. "I'll need the kitchen inventory records. Whatever you have, wherever they are. Same for the garden and the household supply accounts." Mrs. Aldridge blinked. Then something in her expression shifted. Not quite warmth, but the beginning of something like it. "I'll have them for you by morning." The ranch hand's skepticism was not subtle, which Evelyn had anticipated and didn't take personally. Skepticism was a reasonable response to a 26-year-old woman walking in to manage 40 men who'd been doing their jobs, in most cases, for years. She would have been skeptical too. The first test came on her second morning. She'd gone out to the east pasture to walk the fence line and assess the livestock condition. Basic orientation, nothing complicated. When she came across a cluster of 4 hands standing near a broken section of fence, not fixing it, having what appeared to be a leisurely conversation about whether the break had happened last week or the week before. She stopped her horse and looked at the fence, then at the 4 men. "How long has this been down?" The oldest of them, a raw-boned man named Tully with a gray-streaked beard, looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has decided in advance not to be cooperative. "Week, maybe. Holt used to give us a list." "I'm not Holt," she said. "I'm also not interested in how it's been done. The fence is down and there are cattle in the adjacent section who can reach the creek crossing if it stays down, which means they will reach it because cattle do not exercise restraint." She looked at the materials situation. There were posts and wire in the supply wagon 20 yards away, which meant someone had brought the supplies out and then stopped. "What's the holdup?" Silence. "Is it the materials? Is it a skill issue? Is it a question about how this section should be configured?" She kept her voice level. She wasn't performing patience. She genuinely wanted to know if there was an actual problem. "Because if there's a reason this is complicated, tell me and we'll solve it. If there's not, I'd like it fixed by noon." Tully squinted at her. "You always talk this much?" "Usually more," she said. "Fence? Noon." She turned her horse and rode back toward the barn. It was fixed by 10:30. She noted that too. The ledger situation was worse than Barrett had indicated, which was saying something because he hadn't been optimistic. She spent the first 3 evenings in the office going through what existed. 8 years of supply records in Holt's cramped handwriting, organized in a system that made complete sense once she'd identified its internal logic, but had no index and no summary. The financial records were separately kept, in a different format, cross-referenced to the supply ledgers by a notation system that Holt had apparently invented and never explained to anyone. She made a new index. She created a summary sheet for each year. She noted every discrepancy and every gap. By the end of the first week, she had a working picture of the operation. Not complete, but functional. Well enough to start. Barrett came into the office on Saturday evening to find her at the desk with 3 ledgers open and a sheet of her own notes running down the left side of a fresh page. "I didn't expect the light to still be on," he said. "I'm finishing the hay inventory cross-reference." She didn't look up. "The current stock is about 15% below what we need to carry the full herd through a hard winter. If we have a mild one, we'll be fine. If we have a hard one, we'll need to purchase additional feed by February at the latest, which will cost more than buying it now." How much more? Roughly 30% more based on the last 3 years' pricing that Holt recorded. I can get an actual current quote from the feed supplier in town Monday, if you want exact numbers. He came around the desk and looked at the spreadsheet she'd made without asking if he could. She didn't mind. It was his ranch. "You did this in a week," he said. The bones were there. Holt was methodical, just not in a way that anyone else could navigate. I could see what he was trying to track. I just had to translate it. She looked up at him. "Your previous hay delivery was short, by the way. About 3%. Either the supplier miscounted or someone shaved the load." Barrett's expression sharpened. "Which supplier?" "Henderson Feed out of Crestfall, 2 deliveries ago." She'd pulled the delivery receipt and compared it against Holt's actual inventory count from the same period. The numbers had a small but consistent gap. "Could be an honest error, could be something else. I'd want to see the next delivery weighed before it's unloaded." He looked at her for a moment. "That hasn't been standard practice." "It should be." A beat of silence. Outside, the night was cold and still, the way high desert nights got after the sun went down hard. "I'll arrange for a scale to be at the delivery point," he said. "I already arranged it," she said, "with Tully. He'll be there." Barrett stared at her. She couldn't entirely read his expression, somewhere between thrown and something else she didn't have a name for. "You've been here a week," he said. "The delivery is Tuesday. I didn't want to wait." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "My wife would have liked you." It came out quietly, not like a compliment he'd planned. She felt the weight of it without letting it show on her face. "I'll have the full winter inventory summary done by Monday morning," she said. He nodded and left. She listened to his footsteps cross the yard back to the main house, and then the night was quiet again, and she turned back to the ledger. The ranch hand's acceptance was not a single moment. It was a gradual accumulation of small things, which was how most real shifts happened. It was Evelyn knowing that the south water tank had a slow leak before the man responsible for it had noticed. It was her talking the supplier down 15 cents on the per-unit price for grain by pointing out that their delivery schedule had been inconsistent. It was the way she didn't demand things she hadn't proven she deserved, but also didn't ask permission for things that were clearly her call. The man who shifted first was not Tully, who remained watchful and skeptical in a way she found almost comfortable in its consistency. It was a younger hand named Pete, 18 or 19, who came to her the end of the second week with a horse that had a swelling in its left foreleg and a worried expression. "I didn't want to bother Mr. Barrett," he said. She crouched and ran her hand along the leg, feeling for heat and the particular quality of the swelling. "How long?" 2 days. "It's not serious yet, but it needs to be treated, and that leg needs rest. No riding." She stood up and looked at Pete, who clearly expected to be in trouble for not reporting it sooner. "What's this horse's name?" He blinked. "Copper." "All right, Copper gets the far stall for 2 weeks, and you check that leg morning and night and tell me if the swelling spreads or he shows any lameness. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "And Pete," he looked at her, "next time don't wait 2 days. An injury caught early is half the work of one caught late." He nodded fast and took the horse. She watched him go and then went back to the task she'd been doing, which was confirming the count of fence posts in the supply shed and didn't think much more about it. But the next morning, Pete brought her a cup of coffee when he came to report on Copper's leg, and after that, the younger hand started to treat her as a fact of the place rather than a question. She had been at Blackstone Ranch for 3 weeks when Cole Barrett did something that surprised her. He knocked on the office door at midday, an hour she was usually working, not eating, which he'd apparently noticed, and he was holding 2 plates. Mrs. Aldridge made too much, he said, which was transparently not true, because Mrs. Aldridge ran a kitchen with the precision of a military operation and never made too much of anything. But Evelyn didn't say that. "Thank you," she said, and moved the hay records to one side of the desk. He sat down across from her, in the chair that was theoretically for people conducting ranch business, and set 1 plate in front of her and kept 1 for himself. They ate in silence for a minute, which was not uncomfortable. "I got a letter from Henderson Feed this morning," he said eventually, adjusting the delivery terms. "They're offering to make good on the previous shortage, and they've offered a revised pricing structure. That's a better outcome than I expected." She said it honestly. She'd expected a negotiation. "Tully told me you'd flagged 6 other supply relationships that might need review." She looked up. "Tully told you. He came and found me." A pause. "He said, and I'm quoting, 'the new one's actually sharp.'" He said it without any particular emphasis, as if he was simply relaying information, but she caught something in the way he said it that wasn't entirely neutral. "High praise from Tully," she said. "It is, actually." He was quiet for a moment, eating. "He didn't like the last 3 people I hired for anything. Holt he tolerated because Holt had seniority, and Tully respects seniority, but he's never told me someone was sharp." She looked at her plate. "I haven't done anything complicated. I've just paid attention. Most people don't," he said. And then, as if he hadn't said anything particularly significant, "The creek crossing in the north section needs reinforcement before the spring thaw. I'd like your assessment of what it'll take." "I can ride out Thursday." "I'll come with you." She glanced at him. He was back to eating, plainly focused on his food, and she couldn't tell if the offer was practical or something else. She decided it didn't matter. "Thursday, then," she said. "What?" The Thursday ride was the first time she spent an extended period in his company without either of them being focused on a specific task. The creek crossing was a legitimate concern. The bank on the north side had eroded through the previous spring, and whoever had assessed it over the summer had underestimated how much further it would deteriorate over winter. She walked the bank carefully, took measurements, noted where the current ran hardest. Barrett worked alongside her without being in the way, which was its own kind of skill. He knew when to hold the measuring line and when to stay back. And he didn't offer opinions about things he hadn't asked about. But when she'd finished her assessment and they were riding back, he asked questions. Real ones, not the kind that were actually arguments waiting to happen. "The reinforcement approach I'd recommend is going to take about 4 days of labor," she said, after she'd laid out the plan. "More if the weather turns. But if we wait until spring, we'll be doing emergency repairs instead of planned ones, and emergency repairs cost twice as much." "Do it in November," he said immediately, "before the ground freezes." "That's my recommendation, yes." He nodded. They rode for a while. The land out here was wide and dry and hard, and she'd come to find something honest about that. The way the country didn't pretend to be other than what it was. "You're not from this territory," he said. Not an accusation, just an observation. "Wyoming, originally. Came south about 4 years ago when Rourke offered a good wage." "Why'd you stay after the Rourke situation got bad?" She thought about that. "Because quitting every time something went wrong would mean spending my whole life moving." She looked at the horizon. "I've moved enough. I wanted to be somewhere long enough for the work to mean something." He didn't say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was quieter than usual. "That's how I felt about this place when I was building it." A pause. "I've been here so long that I stopped noticing it again. After Eleanor died." He said the name carefully, like he'd learned to handle it without showing the weight. "I just kept running the operation, because that's what you do." She didn't offer anything in response. She understood that some things didn't need responses, just acknowledgement. They rode back in the quiet of the late afternoon, and when they reached the yard and dismounted and handed their horses off to the boy who came to take them, Cole Barrett said, "You're good at this work." "I know," she said. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackstone Ranch, she saw something that might have been the start of a smile cross his face. He turned toward the house, and she turned toward the office. and the afternoon light fell long and even across the yard between them. By the end of her first month, Evelyn had reorganized the supply ledgers into a system that anyone could navigate, negotiated revised terms with 3 vendors, flagged 2 pieces of equipment that needed repair before winter, supervised the creek crossing reinforcement, and quietly shifted the whole rhythm of the ranch's operations without announcing that she was doing it. The thing about good management she'd figured out early was that it shouldn't look like management at all. It should look like the place just running correctly. The problem was visible. The fix was invisible. That was the point. She was sitting on the porch of the East Wing one evening, her 3rd week, before it had gotten cold enough to make sitting outside uncomfortable, when Tully came and leaned on the porch rail with his arms crossed and looked at the middle distance in the manner of a man who had something to say and was taking his time getting to it. She waited. She'd learned the pace of him. "Those creek repairs held through that early cold snap," he said finally. "Good. Holt would have pushed that to spring." "I know." She'd seen as much in the notes. Spring would have been too late. Tully was quiet. A horse moved in the paddock. The wind came across the flats with a bite in it. "I didn't think you'd last a week," he said. "I know that too." "You're all right," he said, in the way that people said things when they meant considerably more than the words. She looked at him. "Thank you, Tully." He nodded once and walked back toward the bunkhouse, and she watched him go and felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph exactly, and not relief. Something more like rightness, like arriving somewhere she'd been heading without knowing it. The ranch stretched out around her in the last light, 11,000 acres of it, and the windmill turned against the dark sky. And somewhere in the main house a lamp came on in the window, and it was not exactly what she would have called warm, but it was something. It was a start. The cold settled in the way it always did in that part of the territory. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in increments, each morning a little harder than the last, the frost line creeping further down into the soil until the ground made a sound like packed clay when you walked on it. Evelyn noticed it the way she noticed most things, not with alarm, but with calculation. Winter in this country was not a surprise. It was a deadline. She'd been at Blackstone Ranch for 5 weeks when the first real problem announced itself, and it didn't announce itself loudly. It came in the form of numbers that didn't add up. She'd been working through the household supply accounts, Mrs. Aldridge's domain, which the housekeeper had handed over with the careful dignity of someone surrendering something they'd managed alone for a long time, when she found the discrepancy. Not in the food stores, which were orderly enough, but in the dry goods ordering pattern. For the past 2 years, the ranch had been ordering roughly the same quantities of lamp oil, candles, and winter supplies in October regardless of how many men were on the winter payroll. Some years that was 30 men. Some years it was 38. The order never changed. She brought it to Mrs. Aldridge directly, which she'd learned was always better than working around her. "The October supply order," Evelyn said, setting the ledger open on the kitchen table. "It's been the same for 2 years running, but the head count hasn't been." Mrs. Aldridge looked at the numbers. Her expression did the thing it did when she was deciding whether to be defensive, a slight tightening around the eyes, and then it relaxed. "Mr. Holt always placed that order. I handled what I handled, and he handled the ordering." "I know. I'm not saying it was done wrong." Evelyn sat down across from her. "I'm saying we need to recalculate it for this winter. We've got 33 men on the winter roll. If we use last year's numbers, we'll be short on lamp oil by January. In this cold, short on lamp oil means men working in the dark or burning through the reserves we need for the barn heaters." Mrs. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. "I should have caught that." "You weren't supposed to. That was Holt's piece." Evelyn turned the ledger to show her the revised calculation she'd already sketched. "I've worked out what we actually need. I'd like to get the order placed this week if that works for your schedule." The housekeeper studied the numbers. Then she looked up at Evelyn with an expression that wasn't quite gratitude. It was more complicated than that, more like recognition. "You're going to want to know about the kitchen garden," she said. Evelyn had been waiting for that. She'd looked at the kitchen garden every day from her window and had been letting it sit, because some things needed to come from the person who owned them before you could touch them. "Tell me." "Mr. Holt's wife used to tend it, before her, before Eleanor." Mrs. Aldridge folded her hands on the table. "After Eleanor passed, Mr. Barrett told me to let it go. He said he didn't need it. I kept the herb beds going because we need them for the kitchen, But the rest, the vegetable beds, the fruit canes, they've just been sitting for 2 years. 2 years. Ooh. Evelyn looked out the window at the gray tangle of unpruned canes and the collapsed bean frames and the soil that had gone dry and compacted without attention. "The soil's still good," she said. "It is. I'd like to bring it back, if you think that's all right." Mrs. Aldridge was quiet long enough that Evelyn thought she might be about to say it wasn't her decision, which would have been true. But instead she said, "I think it would be good for this house." Evelyn nodded once. She didn't say anything more about it. Some things you just move toward. She raised it with Barrett that evening, briefly and without making anything of it. She found him in the office, which was where he usually was at that hour, going over the cattle records. "The kitchen garden," she said from the doorway. "I'd like to restore it. I'll do the work myself on my own time. I'll need access to the tool shed and I'll need to order some materials, probably $20 in seed and some replacement trellis stakes. I can account for every cent." He looked up from the ledger. Something moved across his face that she couldn't read clearly. Not discomfort, but not neutrality either. "That garden hasn't been touched in a while." "I know. The soil is recoverable. It would be useful for the kitchen and it's wasted space otherwise." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at his ledger. "Do what you think is right," he said. It wasn't exactly enthusiasm, but it was permission, and that was enough. She started on the garden the following Saturday, in the pale morning before the temperature climbed enough to make the work comfortable. She cut back the dead canes first, working methodically through the overgrowth, and she'd been at it for about an hour when she realized Pete was standing at the garden gate watching her. "You need something?" she asked, without stopping. "No, ma'am." He paused. "You want help?" She looked at him. He was bundled into a coat 2 sizes too big, his breath visible in the cold air. She'd noticed that Pete was the kind of young man who needed to feel useful, which was not a bad quality if it was directed correctly. "Get a pair of gloves from the tool shed and bring the small pruning shears," she said. "Start on the far bed." He came back in 3 minutes and set to work without further conversation, which was the correct response. They worked for 2 hours, and by the end of it, the garden had a shape again. Not restored, but started. Pete left when she told him he was done, and she stayed another 20 minutes finishing a row she'd started. Her hands were sore, and she had a blister coming up on her right palm from the pruning shears, which she'd known would happen and had done anyway. Back inside, Mrs. Aldridge handed her a cup of coffee without being asked and said, "Mr. Barrett watched from the upstairs window for a while." Evelyn wrapped both hands around the mug. "Did he?" For about 20 minutes, a pause. He didn't say anything. He just watched and then walked away. She drank her coffee and didn't say anything either, because there wasn't anything useful to say. The supply organization took the better part of 3 weeks, and it was not glamorous work. It meant going through every outbuilding, every storage area, every inventory that Holt had tracked in his head and that had not been written down in any form she could find. It meant asking the ranch hands directly, which some of them found strange, a manager asking what they knew. And it meant reconciling what they said against what the records suggested and what her own eyes could see. The feed barn was his biggest project. It had drifted into a system of stacking that made sense in a historical way. Oldest stock toward the front when Holt knew where the oldest stock was, which he'd known because he'd been there when it was stored, but made no sense to anyone who hadn't watched it accumulate. She reorganized it over 3 days, pulling everything out, cataloging it, restacking it in a rotation system that anyone could follow. Tully supervised the first day from the doorway with his arms crossed and then, without comment, picked up a stack of hay bales and started moving them to where she'd indicated. She didn't thank him extravagantly. She said, "The feed on the west wall needs to come out first." And he nodded and did it, and they worked that way for the rest of the day. The inefficiency in the daily operations was harder to address because it wasn't a single problem. It was an accumulation of small habits that had calcified over time into routine. The way the morning feeding had been scheduled meant that 2 hands were always duplicating each other's work in the north paddock. The way the equipment maintenance had been logged meant that small repairs were being missed until they became medium repairs. The way the supply requisition worked meant that anyone needing something had to go through a process that involved 3 different conversations and usually 2 days of waiting. She didn't announce a new system. She just started doing things the new way and explained it to each person as they encountered it. And within 10 days, the new way was the way things were done. And most of the men probably couldn't have told you exactly when that had happened. Cole Barrett noticed. She could tell because he stopped asking about things that she'd quietly sorted, started asking instead about larger strategic questions. The spring cattle sale timing, the possibility of adding a second water source in the east section, what she thought about the neighbor to the south who'd been grazing his stock close to their shared fence line. He was using her as a thinking partner, and she found she didn't mind it. He was sharp in his own way, and when he asked a real question, he listened to the answer, which was rarer than it should have been. One evening in late November, he came into the office and sat down in the chair across from her. He'd started doing this, coming in around 7, sometimes with a question and sometimes without one, and he said, "You've changed the morning feed schedule." "I have." "Jed complained." "Jed complained to you?" "Jed complains to me about everything. He complained about the way Holt organized the saddle rack for 6 years and never said a word to Holt directly. He picked up his coffee mug, found it full this time. Chets. She'd started keeping a second pot going in the evenings and settled back. He said you rearranged his whole morning. I rearranged the schedule. His actual tasks are the same. He's just doing them in a different order. He says it takes longer. It takes 4 minutes longer because he hasn't adjusted to the sequence yet. In 3 weeks, it'll take 8 minutes less because he won't be doubling back across the paddock. She looked at Barrett directly. Is this a problem? He studied her over the rim of his mug. No, he said. I told him to talk to you directly. What did he say to that? He said he didn't think that was how it worked. What did you say? I said it was. He said it plainly, like it was a small thing, but she felt it land with more weight than that, the simple fact of him backing her up without being asked, without making a speech about it. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. If your way works, I won't have Jed in my office complaining about the feed schedule anymore, which is a benefit to me. Right, she said, and looked back at her work. And he drank his coffee, and the lamp burned between them in the quiet. The storm came on a Thursday in early December, and it came wrong. Wrong angle, wrong timing, wrong everything. The weather in that region followed patterns that the old hands could read, and those patterns had been suggesting a moderate cold snap, maybe some snow, nothing the ranch wasn't prepared for. What arrived instead was something that came up out of the southwest with 40-mile winds and a horizontal sleet that turned to freezing rain by nightfall, coating everything in a quarter-inch of ice and dropping the temperature fast enough that the water in the south stock tank froze solid before anyone had thought to check it. Evelyn was up before the storm fully hit, because she'd woken at 4 in the morning with the particular restlessness that preceded bad weather, and had gone to the window and looked at the sky and not liked what she saw. She was dressed and in the barn by 4:30. She found Pete there already. He had the early feeding shift, looking at the sky through the barn door with the expression of someone hoping they were wrong about what they were seeing. Get Tully, she said. I need him and I need 2 other men. Wake them now. It's not even 5. I know what time it is. Go. He went. She started moving. The immediate concern was the cattle in the south pasture. 60 head of the younger stock that had been rotated out there 10 days ago and hadn't been brought in because the weather hadn't warranted it until now. In this cold, in this wind, with ice forming on every surface, they needed to be moved to the shelter of the main barn, or they'd start losing body heat faster than they could generate it. The younger ones, especially. They didn't have the body mass to wait it out. Tully arrived pulling on his coat, 2 other hands behind him. A man named Garrett and a newer hand called Warren, who Evelyn had assessed as competent but cautious. Good enough. South pasture, she said. We need to move the young stock, all 60. We'll bring them through the main gate and into the east barn. There's space if we clear the supply area, which I'm going to do now. Tully, you and Garrett take the horses and go around the long way. The direct path will be ice by now, and I don't want a horse going down in the dark. Warren, you're with me until they're in visual range, and then you'll open the gate. Miss Carter, Tully said, not argumentatively, but with the weight of experience. In this wind, moving 60 head in the dark. I know, she said. We do it anyway. Slower is fine. We don't rush them. But if we wait for daylight, we lose 2 hours, and in this temperature, that matters. She met his eyes. You've moved cattle in worse. A beat. I have, he said. Then let's go. It was one of the harder 2 hours of her working life. The ice was forming fast. The wind was brutal and directionless. and moving 60 young cattle in darkness through freezing rain with 3 men and a woman who couldn't feel her fingers by the halfway point was not clean or efficient or anything approaching smooth. 2 of the animals broke from the group twice and had to be rounded back, which cost time. Garrett's horse slipped on a patch of ice near the gate and went down on one knee. The horse recovered, Garrett swore loudly and kept going. One of the younger cattle stopped moving entirely and had to be pushed from behind by Warren, while Evelyn kept the herd from drifting left toward the fence line. But they got them in. All 60, counted through the gate by Warren, who was meticulous about counts even under bad conditions, which was why she'd kept him at the gate. She locked the barn and stood in the relative shelter of the doorway, catching her breath. And Tully came and stood next to her and looked at the herd settling into the warmth and said nothing for a long moment. "The water situation," she said, when she had enough breath. "South stock tank. Already froze. I could see it when we came past. We'll need to break it and get a fire going underneath to keep it liquid. Can you—" "I'll handle it. I also want someone checking the north water line. If it's going to freeze anywhere, it'll be at the junction near the ridge." "Garrett can do that." "Good." She pushed off from the wall. "I need to check on Mrs. Aldridge and make sure the house pipes are running. The kitchen line can freeze if it gets cold fast enough." "The kitchen line always freezes in a hard snap," Tully said. "Usually by morning." "Then I'll run it now." She started toward the house. "Tully, good work." She heard him make a sound that wasn't quite a response, but she didn't wait for one. She crossed the yard in the ice and wind with her head down, and the sky to the east was starting to go gray at the very bottom edge. Just the faintest suggestion of coming light, and the storm showed no sign of caring. The kitchen pipe was running. She opened all 3 of the sink taps to a thin stream, enough to keep the water moving, and stood in the warm kitchen for 3 minutes thawing her hands, while Mrs. Aldridge, who had apparently also been up for a while and had clearly already dealt with the fact that the storm was bad, set a pot of coffee on the stove without asking anyone anything. "How bad is the south herd?" she asked. "In the barn, all 60. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her steadily. In this, Evelyn confirmed. The housekeeper poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the counter within reaching distance and didn't say anything else, because sometimes that was the right thing. Barrett came in through the back door 20 minutes later, fully dressed, and looked at Evelyn standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee in both hands. He'd clearly been out already. There was ice on his coat. "The south herd," he said, "in the east barn. Moved them at 4:30. He stopped. Just for a moment, looking at her. "All of them. All 60. The tank is being dealt with and Garrett's checking the north water line." She looked at him over the coffee. "The east barn supply area is going to need reorganization. I cleared it quickly to make room for the animals, and I didn't have time to be neat about it." He was still looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "The temperature dropped 8 degrees between midnight and 4, he said. "I know. I was awake. Those cattle, they would have started showing stress by morning," she said. "In that cold with that wind, especially the yearlings." She set down the coffee. "I should go back out. I want to check the ice on the equipment shed. If the hinges freeze, we'll have trouble getting to the tools." "Evelyn." She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her given name without the miss in front of it, and it came out in a way that made her pause. He was looking at her with something different in his expression from usual. Not the careful assessment she was used to, but something more unguarded. "You moved 60 head of cattle in the dark," he said, "in a freezing rainstorm, on 4 hours of sleep." 3 hours, she said, honestly. "And it needed doing." "I know it needed doing," he said it quietly. "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I would have lost some of those animals." "You might not have." "I would have." He said it without self-pity, just the plain statement of a man who knew his operation. "I've been up since 5, and the first thing I went to check was the south pasture. Those cattle would have been out there for another 2 hours before I'd have gotten to them." She looked at him. She didn't know what to do with this version of him. Not the contained, direct man who asked operational questions, but this one, who was standing in his kitchen saying something he hadn't planned to say. "You have a good ranch," she said, "and good men. Tully was out there before I had finished my sentence. Tully does what you tell him. That's not a small thing." He seemed to hear something in his own voice because he looked away briefly, at the window where the ice was still driving sideways against the glass. This ranch has a lot of things: money, land, cattle, all of it. He was quiet. Eleanor used to say a place needed tending by someone who actually wanted it to survive. She meant her specifically, but I think she was right in general. Mrs. Aldridge had gone very still near the stove. "I want this ranch to survive," Evelyn said. It came out plainly, without inflection, because it was simply true. He looked back at her. Something in his face settled, not softened exactly, but became less braced. "I know," he said. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd dropped it. "The equipment shed hinges," she said. "I'll check them," he said. "Go get warm for 20 minutes first." She almost argued. She didn't. She sat down at the kitchen table with her coffee and let Mrs. Aldridge put a plate of bread in front of her and was grateful for it because she hadn't eaten since the previous night and her hands were still not entirely reliable. The storm blew through by midday. By afternoon, the ice was already beginning to melt from the surfaces, but the cold held and the damage assessment kept Evelyn and Tully busy until nearly dark. A section of fencing on the east perimeter had come down under the ice weight. A gutter on the supply building had pulled loose. One of the water channels had iced over completely despite the work they'd done on it that morning, and needed to be broken through with pike poles before the afternoon was out. But the cattle were fine. Every head accounted for. She was standing at the paddock gate doing a final count by lantern light when she heard boots on the ground behind her and Barrett came to stand at the gate beside her. 87 in the main barn, she said, without looking up from the count. 60 in the east barn, 23 in the paddock that I'm counting now. She finished and made the notation. Totals holding. 394, he said. 394, she lowered the lantern. We lost none. We lost none, he agreed. They stood at the gate and looked at the paddock animals moving quietly in the cold evening air, and the lantern light was warm against the darkness, and neither of them said anything for a while. It wasn't the kind of silence that needed filling. "I want to increase the hay order," she said finally, "after today. We used more than I projected running the east barn, and if we get another storm before January, order what you need," he said. "I'll have numbers for you by tomorrow." He nodded. Then he said, "Evelyn." She looked at him. He was looking at the paddock, not at her, and his expression had something in it that she'd been noticing more in recent weeks. Not grief exactly, not the locked-away quality she'd first seen in him, but something more like a man slowly remembering how to exist in his own house. "You did well today," he said. "We did well," she said. He was quiet a moment. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying things like that?" "I know. Eleanor always said I waited too long to—" He stopped. She was right about most things. She watched his profile in the lantern light, the jaw that was always slightly set, the gray at his temples, the particular stillness of a man who'd spent decades carrying things alone. "It's all right," she said. "I don't need much." He turned to look at her then, and for a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face that wasn't grief and wasn't the careful business-like regard she knew from the office. Something more like the way a man looks at something he didn't expect to find. Then he looked back at the paddock. "Early start tomorrow," he said. "Always," she said, and she picked up her lantern and walked back through the cold dark toward the house. And she didn't look back, though she was aware in some particular way of the sound of his footsteps going the other direction. In the warmth of the kitchen, Mrs. Aldridge handed her a plate and said nothing, and Evelyn sat down and ate, and her hands had finally stopped aching, and somewhere outside the night was very cold and very clear, and the ranch was whole. She didn't let herself think too carefully about the moment at the gate. She filed it in the part of herself where she kept things that didn't have a practical category yet, the part she didn't look at often because looking at things too directly sometimes made them disappear. There was work to do. There was always work to do, and the work was real and reliable in a way that other things weren't, and she understood herself well enough to know that she trusted what was reliable. But she sat there in the kitchen with her plate and her coffee, and she noticed, in the way you notice something before you decide what to think about it, that Blackstone Ranch had stopped feeling like a place she was passing through. The hay order increase turned out to be the right call. 2 weeks after the December storm, another cold front came through. Not as violent, but sustained, the kind of cold that didn't blow in and blow out but just sat on the land for days like a weight. The ranch moved through it without crisis, which was the goal. No crisis meant the work had been done correctly beforehand. Evelyn had learned early that the best management was the kind nobody noticed because nothing went wrong. And the hardest part of that was accepting that nobody would notice. She noticed. That was enough. January settled into a rhythm that she found, to her own mild surprise, not unpleasant. The shorter days meant the work compressed differently. More planning, more repair and maintenance work inside the barns and outbuildings, more time at the desk in the evenings going over numbers. Barrett continued his habit of appearing in the office around 7 with his coffee, and she continued her habit of having something specific to discuss when he arrived, because unstructured conversation was still not something either of them had fully figured out. But the gaps between work topics had gotten longer, and neither of them was in a hurry to fill them anymore. The kitchen garden was dormant under a thin layer of snow, but she'd gotten the beds turned and amended before the ground froze, and the seed order was placed for February delivery. Mrs. Aldridge had started consulting her on household matters without the careful preamble she'd used in the early weeks. Pete had stopped bringing her problems with an apologetic expression and started bringing them the way Tully did, directly, with his own assessment already formed. Small things, but the kind of small things that, accumulated, meant something real about a place. It was the 3rd week of January when the letter arrived. Barrett brought it to her himself, which he didn't usually do with correspondence. He came into the office in the middle of the morning, not his usual hour, and set the envelope on the desk in front of her without preamble. And the expression on his face was the one she'd learned to read as controlled anger, the jaw set slightly tighter than usual, the eyes flat. She looked at the envelope. The return address was a law office in Crestfall. She looked up at him. "Read it," he said. She opened it and read it. It was written in the careful, bloodless language of legal correspondence, which meant it took a moment to understand what it was actually saying, and then it was quite clear. A man named Silas Granger, through his attorneys Pellman and Voss of Crestfall, was filing a formal claim to 40 acres of Blackstone Ranch's northeast section, on the grounds that the original boundary survey of 1847 had been improperly recorded and that the land in question had historically been within the bounds of what was now Granger's operation. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "How long has this boundary existed?" she asked. "Since before my father bought this land." His voice was even in the way it got when he was holding something back. 40 years. The northeast section has been Blackstone land for 40 years. And Granger? Silas Granger bought the operation to the northeast of us 3 years ago, paid too much for it from what I heard, and he's been trying to expand his grazing land ever since. A pause. He's been making offers on the Whitmore property to the south and the Hendricks parcel to the west. No luck. This is a different approach. She looked at the letter again. He's claiming a survey error. He's claiming my father's purchase was based on a faulty survey, which would make the northeast fence line incorrect. He crossed his arms, which would mean 40 acres of my best grazing land is technically in dispute. Does he have a survey to support this? His attorneys mention a subsequently discovered survey document and say it will be presented at the county hearing. Barrett's voice stayed level, but barely. The hearing is in 6 weeks. 6 weeks was not generous. She turned the letter over, looking at the date, confirming the math. Who handles your land records? County Recorder's Office in Crestfall. And I have copies here. Holt kept them in the filing cabinet in the back room. He paused. I think. She looked at him. You think. Holt kept everything. Whether it's organized in any way I can locate is a different question. She was already standing up. Show me the filing cabinet. It was in the back room of the office, a large oak cabinet with 4 drawers that Holt had apparently used as a repository for every piece of paper the ranch had generated or received for 8 years, organized in a system that was, she pulled open the first drawer and looked at it, not immediately obvious. Files were labeled in Holt's cramped handwriting, and many of the labels were abbreviated in ways that probably made sense to a man who knew what he'd put in them. Give me an hour, she said. Evelyn, an hour. Then we'll talk. He left her to it. She went through the cabinet systematically, drawer by drawer, reading every label and pulling anything that might be relevant. Land records, survey documents, boundary correspondence, purchase agreements. It took closer to 90 minutes, and what she found at the end of it was a mixed picture. There were records, yes. Barrett's father's original purchase agreement, several pieces of county correspondence from the 1860s. a copy of what appeared to be the original survey map. But some of it was incomplete, and the survey map was a copy of a copy, faded in places, with a water stain across one corner that obscured a portion of the notation. She brought everything to the main desk and laid it out in order. When Barrett came back, she had it organized by date, with a sheet of her own notes at the front. "Here's what we have," she said. "The original purchase agreement from 1851 references a survey conducted in 1847. We have a copy of that survey, but it's a third or fourth generation copy, and the northeast boundary notation is partially obscured." She pointed to the water-stained corner. "The notation appears to place the boundary at the ridgeline, which is consistent with where your fence currently sits, but a good attorney could argue this copy isn't authoritative." Barrett leaned over the desk looking at the documents. His expression had moved from controlled anger into something more focused, a man looking at a problem rather than reacting to one. "What we don't have," she continued, "is the original survey or any direct reference to the iron boundary markers from the time of the original survey. If those markers still exist on the land, they might," he said. "My father mentioned iron stakes in the ground from the original survey. He pointed one out to me when I was a boy, in the northeast corner near the ridge." He was quiet. "I haven't thought about it in 30 years. If that marker is still there, it's physical evidence that predates any document Granger's attorneys might produce." She met his eyes. "I want to go look. The northeast section is a 3-hour ride in this weather." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll come with you." "You have the—" "I'll come with you," he said again, and she didn't argue. They went the following morning, before the temperature climbed, because the cold made the ground conditions more predictable. No mud, no soft spots, and the snow cover was thin enough that the terrain was readable. Barrett knew the northeast section well enough to navigate it without reference to a map, which was useful because the survey map they were working from was not sufficiently detailed for fine navigation. The northeast corner of the property was defined on one side by the ridge line and on the other by a dry creek bed that only ran in spring. The fence line followed the ridge, sitting at its top where the land dropped away on the other side into terrain that had historically belonged to whoever owned the northeast parcel, which was now Granger. They rode the fence line from south to north, and Evelyn looked at the land the way she'd looked at land her whole working life, reading it for what it told you, not what you expected it to say. The ridge was solid, the fence line clearly maintained on the Barrett side. When they reached the corner post, a heavy timber post set in concrete, weathered but firm, she dismounted and walked the last 100 yards on foot. "My father said it was near the corner post," Barrett said from horseback. "Within 20 feet. She looked. The snow was thin here, maybe an inch, and the ground beneath it was hard. She started from the corner post and moved outward, scanning the ground, looking for the particular look of something old and fixed in the earth. She almost missed it. The top of the iron stake was barely 2 inches above the soil surface, half hidden by a clump of dead grass that had grown up around it. She crouched, cleared the grass away with her gloved hand, and found it. Square iron, roughly an inch across, driven deep into the ground, with a notch cut in the top in the style of survey markers she recognized from an older tradition of land assessment. "Here," she said. He dismounted and came to where she was crouched. He looked at the stake for a long moment. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's what he showed me." He touched the top of it with one finger, and she could see something in his face that wasn't about the legal case, a man touching something his father had touched, something that had been in the ground longer than either of them had been alive. She didn't say anything. She was already pulling a small notebook from her coat pocket, writing down the exact position relative to the corner post, the measurements, the condition. When she was done, she looked up at the ridgeline and then back down the fence. "This marker sits exactly at the ridgeline," she said, "which is exactly where the fence is. Granger's claim is that the boundary should be 20 feet south of this point." She looked at Barrett. "If he moves the line 20 feet south, he picks up the ridge access and the best portion of your northeast grazing area." "And the watershed from the ridge," Barrett said. "In a dry year, that ridge watershed is the difference between my northeast herd eating well and not eating well." She stood up. "I need the name of your lawyer." "Evan Marsh in Crestfall." "Has he seen the letter yet?" "I sent word yesterday." "Good." She looked at the stake once more, then photographed it in her mind. The position, the depth, the style of the notch. "We need 3 things. We need to find the original 1847 survey or the surveyor's records because a copy with water damage isn't going to win this. We need someone qualified to examine and authenticate this marker. And we need to understand what Granger's document actually says before the hearing, so we're not walking in blind. Barrett was looking at her with an expression she'd come to recognize. The particular quality of his attention when she was saying something he was following closely. The original survey, she said. Who would have records of it? A survey done in this territory in 1847? Where would those records be held? Territorial Records Office, he said. Crestfall has some, but the older ones, the ones from before the county was organized, they'd be in the state archives, in the capital. Can Marsh request them? He can try. It takes time. Then he needs to start today. She was already moving back toward her horse. And I want to find whoever surveyors in this region. There were surveyors operating in this territory in the 1840s and 50s. Some of them or their descendants might have records, field notebooks, anything from the original survey. Professional surveyors kept field records. You know about land surveying. I know about records, she said, mounting. Records are records. Someone wrote it down somewhere. We just have to find it. They rode back in the cold, and she spent the ride organizing the problem in her head the way she organized supply ledgers, identifying what she had, what she needed, and what sequence of actions would get her from one to the other most efficiently. Barrett rode beside her without speaking, which she appreciated. He understood that she was working, and he let her work. Finding the surveyor took her 4 days. She started with Marsh, the attorney, who was a careful, methodical man of about 50, who wore reading spectacles and had a habit of finishing her sentences wrong, which she'd learned to work around. He confirmed that the Territorial Records Office had copies of surveys from the period, but that the records were poorly organized and the copy they might have of the 1847 survey was likely the same generation as the one she already had. He'd put in the request to the state archives, he said, but the state archives worked on their own timeline. We need the original surveyor's records, she told him, not the official copy, the field records, the surveyor's own notebooks. Marsh looked at her over his spectacles. The survey was done in 1847. The surveyor is almost certainly dead. The firm might not be, she said. Survey firms in this territory, if they were established, sometimes ran through families. It's worth finding out. He looked like he wanted to say something about the probability of that being useful, and then he looked at her face and didn't. She went to the county recorder's office herself the next day, which involved a 2-hour ride into Crestfall and cold that made the ride unpleasant, but not impossible. The recorder was a young man named Amos, who was clearly not expecting a woman to arrive asking for territorial survey records from 1847, and who hid his surprise reasonably well. She told him what she was looking for. He went to the back and came out 40 minutes later with a box of documents that smelled like the 1860s. The 1847 survey copy they had was indeed the same generation as the one in Holt's cabinet, but in the box there was something else, a letter filed with the land records at some point in the 1870s from a surveying firm called Rutherford and Sons, referencing a boundary confirmation they had performed on the Barrett parcel in 1871. The letter was brief, but it mentioned in passing that their firm had participated in the original 1847 survey as subcontractors to the Territorial Office. Rutherford and Sons. She wrote the name down and looked at Amos. Do you know if this firm still operates? He thought about it. There's a land surveying office in Mill Haven, Rutherford something. My uncle used them when he purchased his property. She was back on the road by afternoon. The surveying office in Mill Haven was operated by a man named George Rutherford, who was the grandson of the firm's founder and who was in his late 50s and had the organized, unhurried manner of a man who had been handling land records his whole life. He listened to what she was looking for with his hands folded on his desk and his expression giving nothing away. The 1847 Barrett survey, he said when she'd finished. Your firm participated in it according to a letter in the county records. We did. He said it without hesitation. My grandfather's field notebooks cover all the surveys his firm participated in from 1839 through 1882. We have the complete collection. She looked at him. You have the field notebooks, indexed by year and parcel. He stood up with the unhurried movement of a man who'd been sitting a long time and was glad of the reason to move. The 1847 Barrett parcel survey. Let me look. He found it in 12 minutes, which she counted, standing in the doorway of the back room where the files were kept in a row of wooden cabinets that smelled like old paper and linseed oil. He came out with a slim notebook, dark green, the leather cover cracked with age, and set it on the desk between them. "May I?" she said. He nodded, and she opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was clear, the practiced, precise hand of a man who recorded measurements for a living, and the entries were dated and specific. She found the Barrett parcel survey in the third section of the book, and she read it carefully, and what she found was exactly what she had hoped to find and had tried not to count on finding. The field notes recorded the placement of 4 iron stakes at the corners of the Barrett parcel. The northeast corner stake was recorded with its exact position relative to natural features, the ridge line, the dry creek bed, with measurements in chains and links, the standard of the period. The notation was unambiguous. The stake was placed at the ridge line, with the Barrett land lying to the south and west of the ridge. 20 feet south would put it inside the Barrett boundary, exactly where the fence currently ran. She looked up at George Rutherford, who was watching her with the patient expression of a man who knew what good records looked like. "I need to hire you," she said. "For what purpose?" "I need you to examine the iron stake that is currently in the ground at the northeast corner of the Barrett parcel, compare its position to these field notes, and provide a written affidavit confirming whether or not the current fence line is consistent with the original 1847 survey." He looked at her steadily. "You're going to court. In 5 weeks. The other party will have their own surveyor." "I expect so. Can you be available to examine the site?" He was quiet a moment, looking at the notebook. Then he looked at her. "My grandfather did this survey. He took pride in his work." He said it simply, without drama. "Yes, I can be available." She thanked him, which she meant, and rode back to Blackstone Ranch with the feeling of a person who has found the thing they went looking for and is now aware that finding it was only the beginning of the work. Barrett was in the main house when she arrived back, which was where he tended to be in the evenings when the office work was done. She found him in the sitting room, a room she hadn't been in often, which had the quality of a space that hadn't been fully inhabited in some time. The furniture good but slightly stiff. A fireplace that was burning tonight because the cold had gotten into the house through the north windows. He was reading something, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "Sit down," he said, which she'd noticed he said more often now, and with different weight than when he'd said it the first day she'd arrived. Less instruction, more invitation. She sat and told him what she'd found. She laid it out in order. The letter from Rutherford and Sons and the county records, the firm still operating in Millhaven, the field notebooks, the specific notation about the northeast stake. When she was done, she set the copy of her notes on the side table between them. He looked at the notes without picking them up. The fire was burning steadily, and the room was warm, and there was a quality to the silence that was different from the office silences. Not charged, but more personal. "My grandfather placed those stakes," he said, "and my father built that fence on the line they defined." "Yes, Granger knows this. He has to know." His voice was quiet and flat. "This is not a good faith dispute about a boundary error. He knows where the line is. He's betting that I don't have the records to prove it." "He may have been right about that 2 months ago," she said, "before Holt's files were properly organized." He looked at her then, and the thing in his expression was not quite the same as what she'd seen at the paddock gate in December. It was more specific than that, more direct. "He picked a bad time to try this." "He picked the time he thought was good," she said. "He was working with outdated information." A pause. "Because of you." She shook her head slightly. "The records were always there. I just found them." "Evelyn." He said her name the way he'd started saying it, without the formality he'd used in the beginning, but not easily either, like something he was still learning the shape of. "You rode to Crestfall, to Millhaven, located a 70-year-old field notebook in a surveying firm's archive, hired the man on the spot, and came back with everything we need in 4 days. That is not just finding records." She looked at the fire. "The legal case still has to be won. Rutherford can provide the affidavit and the testimony, but Granger's attorneys will push back hard on anything they can attack. We need Marsh to be prepared for that." "I'll meet with Marsh this week." "I'd like to be there." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I found the records, I know what they say, and I'll spend the meeting correcting misunderstandings if I'm not in the room." She said it without apology. I'm also better at this kind of document analysis than Marsh. Not the law. He knows the law. But the records. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, without any indication that it surprised him, "Thursday. We'll go together." She nodded. Then, because the evening had stretched and the fire was warm and she was tired in a way that was not unpleasant, the tiredness of having done something real, she said, "What do you know about Granger, beyond what he's done here?" Barrett leaned back slightly. He came into this territory 3 years ago, bought the Alvarez operation at a price that didn't make sense for the land value, which suggested he either doesn't understand cattle economics or he was buying for a reason other than the cattle. He paused. He runs a larger operation further north, though. I've heard 5,000 head, maybe more. He's been expanding south for 2 years, buying what he can, pressuring what he can't buy. What does he want with this territory specifically? The water, Barrett said simply. The ridgeline in the northeast section controls the watershed into the valley on his side. If he moves that boundary 20 feet, he picks up the shed. In a dry year, that's worth 10 times what the land itself is worth to a man running 5,000 head. So this is about water access. It's always about water out here. He looked at the fire. He's going to fight this hard. Losing in court won't stop him. It'll just mean he tries something else. She sat with that for a moment. One thing at a time, she said. The hearing first. He nodded. The hearing first. The preparation for the county hearing consumed the next 4 weeks. Marsh was capable, but needed managing, which she did with the direct efficiency she applied to everything. Sitting across from him in his office with the documents laid out and working through every point that Granger's attorneys might attack and how to counter it. George Rutherford came to the Barrett Ranch to examine the iron stake and produced a written affidavit that was precise and authoritative, in the manner of a man who understood exactly how much weight professional documentation carried. Granger's document, when Marsh finally obtained a copy through the proper legal channels, turned out to be a secondary survey produced in 1869 by a surveyor named Acker, who had operated briefly in the territory before relocating. The Acker survey placed the northeast boundary 22 feet south of the original 1847 stake. It didn't explain why it differed from the original survey. It didn't reference the iron markers. It simply drew a different line. It's a confection, Evelyn said, sitting with Marsh and Barrett in the attorney's office, looking at the Acker survey. Marsh looked at her over his spectacles. It's a legal document. It's a document that contradicts a prior survey without explanation, was produced 22 years after the original, and is signed by a surveyor who left the territory in 1871 and whose professional record I would like to examine before Thursday. She looked at Marsh. Can you find out what other work this Acker did? Whether there were any disputes about his surveys, whether he was operating under a valid territorial license at the time? Marsh blinked. Yes, I can research that. Do it before Thursday, she said. Barrett said nothing during this exchange, but when they left Marsh's office and were walking to where the horses were tied, he said quietly, he was going to let the Acker survey stand unchallenged. He wasn't going to challenge it in the right way, she said. He would have argued the weight of evidence, older survey versus newer survey. But if Acker's professional record has problems, we can challenge the document's foundational credibility. That's a better argument. How do you know this? I don't know law, but I know that a document is only as reliable as the person who made it, and that's true whether it's a supply ledger or a land survey. She untied her horse. I've been reading records for 6 years. The same principles apply. He looked at her for a moment with the long, focused look that had become familiar to her. You should have been a lawyer. I don't like being indoors enough, she said, and mounted. And he almost smiled and mounted his own horse, and they rode back through the cold January streets of Crestfall toward the road home. Marsh's research on Acker turned out to be productive. The surveyor had been involved in 2 separate boundary disputes in his brief career in the territory, both of which had been resolved against the surveys he'd produced. More significantly, Marsh found that Acker's territorial surveying license had lapsed in 1868, 1 year before the survey Granger was using as his central evidence had been conducted. She read Marsh's letter when it arrived and then went directly to the office, where Barrett was working, and handed it to him without comment. He read it and set it down on the desk. His surveyor wasn't licensed when he produced the survey, he said. It doesn't automatically invalidate the document, she said. But it raises the question of why Granger's attorneys chose this particular survey as their foundation when a straightforward check of the surveyor's record would have revealed the licensing issue. Either they didn't check, which speaks to the quality of their preparation, or they did check and chose to proceed anyway, which speaks to their willingness to use a problematic document. Barrett looked at her. Either way, it's something. Either way, it's something we put in front of the county judge on Thursday. The night before the hearing, she sat in the office after Barrett had gone to the main house, and she went through the documents one final time. Not because she needed to review them, she had the details committed to memory, but because she was the kind of person who needed to hold a thing in her hands before she walked into a fight. The field notebook, the affidavit from George Rutherford, the original purchase agreement, the letter from Rutherford and Sons in the county records, the copy of the 1847 survey with its partially obscured notation, the Acker survey, and Marsh's documentation of Acker's licensing lapse. She laid them out in order and looked at them. It was a strong case. She knew it was a strong case. But strong cases in court were not the same thing as won cases, and she had enough experience with the way the world worked to know that the right answer didn't always arrive cleanly. She heard footsteps in the yard, and then Barrett appeared in the office doorway. He'd already changed from his day clothes and was clearly on his way to bed, but something had brought him back across the yard. He looked at the documents laid out on the desk. Then he looked at her. "You should sleep," he said. "In a few minutes." He stood in the doorway for a moment. "I've been thinking about what I'd be facing tomorrow without you having found those records," he said. Marsh with a water-damaged copy of a survey and an iron stake that nobody could officially verify. It would have been harder. We'd have lost, Evelyn. She looked at the documents. "You don't know that." "I do know that." He said it with the certainty of a man who had been in enough difficult situations to know when one was going the wrong direction. Granger chose this timing because he thought the ranch was vulnerable, because I'd been distracted. For 2 years. He paused. He wasn't entirely wrong about that. He was wrong about what he'd find when he tested it, she said. Something in his face shifted. Not toward sentimentality. She'd noticed he didn't tend that direction, and she respected it, but toward the kind of plainness that was actually more honest than sentiment. "Yes," he said. He was wrong about that. She looked at him, in the lamplight. The broad set of his shoulders, the gray at his temples. The face that had been carrying a weight it had learned to hide well, but was, she thought, carrying it a little more lightly than it had been 2 months ago. "I'll be ready by 6, she said. He nodded. "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night," she said, and he crossed back through the yard to the main house, and she gathered the documents into their folder and tied it closed, and she sat for one more moment in the quiet of the office she had made her own, and then she put out the lamp and went to bed. The morning of the hearing was clear and very cold, the kind of cold that made the air feel sharp against the face and put a hard edge on everything. The light, the sound of hooves on frozen ground, the particular silence of the land before the day started. Evelyn was in the yard by 5:30, dressed in the best clothes she owned that were also practical enough for a 2-hour ride, which meant a dark wool jacket over her work shirt and the good boots she'd been saving since Denton Creek. She'd braided her hair and pinned it, which took longer than she liked, but mattered for the same reason that the pressed collar had mattered the day she'd ridden out to interview for this position. Not performance, but precision. How you arrived told people something before you spoke. Barrett came out at 5:45. He was dressed in the manner of a man who wore good clothes infrequently and put them on with the slightly uncomfortable formality of someone not entirely at home in them. Dark coat, clean shirt, hat that had been brushed. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about how the other looked, which was the right call. Tully was holding both horses. He handed the reins to Barrett first, then to Evelyn, and he said, not looking at either of them directly, in the way he said things when they mattered to him, "You've got it." "We'll see," Evelyn said. "You've got it," he said again, with the finality of a man who didn't repeat himself often. They rode to Crestfall mostly in silence, which was comfortable in the way their silences had become comfortable. Not empty, just unpressured. Marsh met them outside the county building at 8:30, carrying his document case with the careful attention of a man transporting something fragile. George Rutherford was already there, standing with his hands in his coat pockets, and he nodded at Evelyn in the manner of someone who had decided she was competent and had no further questions about it. The county hearing room was a plain space, wooden benches, a raised desk for the county judge, 2 tables facing it. The judge was a man named Caldwell, somewhere past 60, with a gray beard and the unhurried manner of someone who had presided over enough disputes to be unimpressed by the theatrics that people brought to them. He came in at 9 o'clock and settled himself without ceremony. Silas Granger was already seated at the opposite table when they arrived. She'd expected a large man. The territory's mythology ran to large men. But Granger was compact and neat, somewhere in his mid-50s, with a pale, careful face and small eyes that moved around the room the way an animal's eyes moved, registering everything without appearing to focus on any of it. He was dressed better than Barrett, which was deliberate, and he had 2 attorneys to Marsh's 1, which was also deliberate. He did not look at Evelyn when she came in. He looked at Barrett with an expression of practiced confidence, the look of a man who had already decided how the day would end. She set the document folder on their table and organized it without looking at Granger at all. His attorneys opened first. The lead one was a man named Pellman, the name from the original letter, who was younger than she'd expected, somewhere around 40, with a polished courtroom manner that moved fast and used language precisely. He laid out Granger's position in about 20 minutes. The 1847 survey was imprecise. The 1869 Acker survey corrected an original error. The northeast fence line of Blackstone Ranch had been sitting on Granger's land for decades, without Granger's predecessor having taken legal action, and the county should now formalize the correct boundary. It was a clean argument. She'd known it would be. The question was whether it would survive what came next. Marsh presented the Barrett position with careful thoroughness. The original purchase agreement, the field notebook from Rutherford and Sons, the argument about the iron marker. He was methodical, which was his strength. When Pellman raised objections, Marsh addressed them without rushing. The licensing issue on the Acker survey he saved until near the end, presenting the documentation quietly and without embellishment, and she watched Caldwell's expression shift fractionally when that information landed. Just a slight sharpening of attention, but she saw it. The moment that changed the room's temperature came when Pellman moved to cross-examine George Rutherford. Rutherford was on the stand in the measured way of a man who had given professional testimony before and understood that his value was in precision, not performance. Pellman circled around the field notebook first, questioning the chain of custody, questioning whether it had been modified, questioning the handwriting. Rutherford answered each question with the unhurried certainty of someone who had spent 50 years working with documents and knew exactly what he was looking at. He had compared the handwriting in the notebook to his grandfather's other professional documents. He had verified the dating through the index system his grandfather had used. The notebook was authentic. Then Pellman shifted. Mr. Rutherford, you've stated that the iron marker currently in the ground at the Barrett northeast corner is consistent with the placement described in your grandfather's field notes, but you've also acknowledged you cannot confirm that the marker currently in the ground is the original marker from 1847. Is that correct? I cannot confirm its age through physical examination alone, Rutherford said. No. So the marker could have been placed at any time. It could have been placed at any time by anyone with the knowledge of where the original marker was located and a reason to replicate it. Pellman paused. She could see him deciding whether to push further, and then he said, "No further questions." Caldwell looked at Marsh. "Redirect?" Marsh glanced at her. She had been expecting this moment, and she'd prepared for it with Marsh 3 days ago. He nodded slightly. "Mr. Rutherford," Marsh said, standing, "in your professional experience, 50 years of land surveying, is it common for property owners to fabricate iron boundary markers in the positions that favor their existing fence lines?" Pellman was on his feet. "Objection. Calls for speculation." "Goes to professional context, Your Honor," Marsh said, and held Caldwell's gaze. Caldwell thought about it for a moment. "I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Rutherford." Rutherford looked at Pellman with the mild expression of a man watching an argument he'd already evaluated. "In 50 years of surveying, he said, I have encountered one case of fabricated markers. In that case, the fabricated markers were placed at a new location to support a claim that the original markers did not support. He paused. The marker in the Barrett northeast corner is placed at the ridge line, which is exactly where the original 1847 survey notation places the boundary. If someone had fabricated this marker, they would have had to know the precise position described in my grandfather's field notebook, which has been in the possession of my firm's archive and has not been made public. The room was quiet. "No further questions," Marsh said, and sat down. She allowed herself nothing, not a shift in posture, not a change of expression. But under the table, her left hand, which she'd kept flat on her thigh for the entire proceeding, relaxed slightly. The remainder of the hearing moved over the next 2 hours. Pellman pushed hard on the Acker survey's standing, arguing that a licensing lapse didn't invalidate a document's accuracy, which was technically true, and which Marsh countered by pointing out that a lapse in professional licensing at the time of a survey's production was a material fact that bore on the weight the court should assign to it. Caldwell asked several questions of his own, direct, specific questions that told her he'd understood the core of the issue immediately and was now confirming details. At the end, Caldwell said he would take the matter under advisement and issue his ruling within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. She'd expected that. It was the nature of these proceedings. They rode back with Marsh in the cold afternoon, and Marsh was cautiously optimistic in the careful way of attorneys who had learned not to predict outcomes. Rutherford had gone ahead back to Millhaven with the understated manner of a man who had done his part and had no further comment. Barrett rode beside her and said very little, and she understood that he was doing what he did with difficult waiting, putting it somewhere internal and letting it sit. She'd have done the same. The 2 weeks were not comfortable. The ranch work continued as it always did: cattle, fences, equipment, supplies, the daily operational rhythm that didn't adjust for legal proceedings. She worked through it the way she always worked, which was with full attention, because the alternative was to give part of her attention to worrying, and worrying had never fixed anything she'd been aware of. But the waiting had a quality to it that was different from the anticipatory tension before the hearing. That had been something she could prepare for. This was something she could only endure. Barrett was quieter during those 2 weeks. Not cold, not the distance she'd encountered in the early weeks of her time here, but something more like a man standing still while he waited to find out if the ground was solid. She respected it. She didn't push at it. The ruling arrived on a Wednesday morning, delivered by a rider from Crestfall who handed the envelope to Barrett directly. She was in the office when he brought it in, and she watched his face as he read it, watched for the shift that would tell her before the words did. His expression changed, not dramatically. The jaw unclenched by a degree she'd learned to notice. He set the letter on the desk in front of her. Caldwell had ruled in Barrett's favor. The northeast boundary of Blackstone Ranch was confirmed at the ridgeline as established by the 1847 survey. The Acker survey was determined to be of insufficient credibility given the licensing issue and the absence of any explanation for its divergence from the original document to supersede the original. Granger's claim was dismissed. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Barrett. "All right," she said. He looked back at her. "That's what you have to say?" "I could say more, but it wouldn't add anything." He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, see, more like the beginning of one that he caught before it arrived. But she'd gotten good at reading the early signals. "We should tell Tully," he said. "He'll have heard from the rider before we get out the door." "Probably." He picked up the letter and looked at it again. Something in his posture had changed, though she couldn't have described exactly what. Something lighter about it. "I'm going to write to Marsh today, and to Rutherford. Tell Rutherford the date of his grandfather's notebook," she said. "He'll appreciate knowing it held up." "I will." He looked at her again, and the look was the direct one, the one that didn't have the professional quality of the early months. "I don't know how to thank you for this." "Then don't try," she said. "The ranch is intact. That's the point." He was quiet for a moment. "You said the ranch, not your job, not the result." She met his gaze. "I know what I said." The silence between them had the particular quality of things that were understood without being spoken, and she let it be that way because pushing at it felt wrong, and because she was still not entirely sure what to do with the fact that Blackstone Ranch had, at some point in the past 3 months, stopped being a position she held and become something that felt more essential than that. The news moved through the ranch the way news always moved in a place where people lived and worked in close proximity, fast, imprecise, and embellished at the edges. Tully's version, which she overheard him telling Garrett by the water trough that afternoon, involved George Rutherford's testimony dismantling Granger's case in a manner that was roughly twice as dramatic as what had actually occurred. She didn't correct it. The spirit was accurate. Pete found her in the feed barn that evening and said, with the earnestness of his age, "Is it true you found the original survey papers in an archive in Millhaven and that's what won the case?" "Something like that," she said. "Tully says Granger's attorneys didn't know what hit them." "Tully's generous." She handed him the feed bucket she'd been filling. North Paddock. He took it and went, and she watched him go with the mild satisfaction of seeing someone young and capable moving through the world without second-guessing himself. She'd tried to do that, where she could, with the younger hands. Not consciously, not as a program. Just the recognition that watching someone be competent without apology was itself a kind of instruction. Silas Granger's response to the ruling came 10 days later, and it didn't come from his attorneys. It came from the merchants in Crestfall. She found out from Henderson Feed, the same supplier she'd renegotiated terms with in her first weeks. A note arrived with the standard supply order confirmation, brief and slightly awkward in its phrasing, saying that Henderson Feed was reviewing its contracts with Blackstone Ranch and would be in touch regarding future arrangements. She read it twice and then rode to Crestfall the following morning to see Henderson directly. Jim Henderson was a decent man in the way that decent men sometimes become complicated when money was involved. Not corrupt exactly, but susceptible to pressure from directions he hadn't fully examined. He was uncomfortable when she sat down across from him in his office, which told her what she needed to know before he started speaking. "It's not personal," he said, which it never was, in the experience of people who had been on the receiving end of it. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. He shifted in his chair. "Granger placed a significant order with us last week, long-term supply arrangement. He made it clear that he preferred we not continue servicing competing operations in the region." He made it clear. He was direct about his preferences. She looked at Henderson steadily. "And you're considering honoring those preferences?" "I'm considering my business position, Miss Carter." "Your business position," she said, "includes a 3-year supply relationship with Blackstone Ranch, revised terms that are currently more favorable to you than they were 18 months ago, and a client who pays on time." She kept her voice level. "What is Granger offering you?" "A contract for—" He stopped, rearranged his expression. "That's not something I can share. Jim." She used his first name, which she didn't usually do, because the situation called for directness and formality was in the way. "You've been supplying this ranch since before Cole Barrett's father died. You know what Blackstone represents in this region. You also know what Granger represents, which is a man who just lost a legal proceeding for making a claim he knew was wrong." She paused. "If he's willing to use his supply relationships to pressure ranches that went against him in court, what do you think he'll do with yours once you're dependent on his contract?" Henderson was quiet. She could see the calculation happening, the short-term security of Granger's contract against the long-term risk of being in debt to a man who used leverage without hesitation. "I'm not trying to make this harder than it is," she said. "I'm telling you what you already know, which is that there are 2 kinds of business relationships in this territory. The kind where both parties have something to gain from the other's success, and the kind where one party is looking for an advantage to use." She stood up. "We'd like to continue our arrangement. I'll leave you to think about it." She rode back to the ranch and told Barrett what she'd found, plainly and without drama. He listened to the whole thing before he responded. "Granger's pressuring our suppliers," he said. "Henderson, at least. Probably others." She sat across from him in the office. "It's the next move after losing in court. He can't take the land, so he's trying to make operating the ranch more difficult." "How many suppliers are we talking about?" "I don't know yet. I want to contact each of them directly this week, find out who he's approached and what he's offered." She'd already made a list. "Some of them will hold. The ones with long relationships and clear mutual interest, they'll hold. The ones who are newer or have narrower margins might not." Barrett was looking at the desk, thinking. "And the ones who don't hold? We find alternatives. There are suppliers in Millhaven and in the southern counties who'd welcome Blackstone's business. It's not ideal, some longer delivery distances, but it's workable." She met his eyes. "This is manageable. He's trying to make us feel isolated, and he can't because we have enough relationships and enough operational flexibility. But I want to know the full picture before I tell you it's fine." He nodded. Go find it. The survey of the supplier relationships took 4 days and involved more writing than she'd done in a single week since arriving at the ranch. She went to each vendor personally: feed, lumber, equipment repair, dry goods. And in each case, she asked directly whether they'd been approached by Granger or his representatives. Some hadn't. Either they were too small to matter to Granger's strategy, or they operated in a part of the territory that wasn't relevant to his interests. Of the ones that had been approached, 3 declined to tell her anything, which told her what they'd decided. 4 others confirmed they'd received approaches and were in the process of evaluating them. Henderson, when she rode back through Crestfall on the 3rd day, told her he was staying with Blackstone Ranch. He said it with the slightly defiant manner of a man who had talked himself into a decision he wasn't entirely at ease with, and she shook his hand and thanked him without making him more uncomfortable than he already was. The harder news was the rumor. She heard it first from a woman named Clara Bates, who ran the dry goods store in Crestfall, and who told her, with the careful phrasing of someone sharing something they knew might hurt, "People are saying, and I want you to know I don't give it any weight, people are saying that the woman running Barrett's ranch has been doing more than managing it." Evelyn looked at her without changing expression. "People say a lot of things. They're saying it because Granger's men have been in town talking." Claire's voice had an edge that wasn't directed at Evelyn. "I wanted you to know it was coming from that direction, so you knew." "I appreciate that." She did appreciate it. "Thank you, Clara." She didn't bring it to Barrett immediately. She sat with it for 2 days, which was not something she usually did with problems. She usually brought problems forward as soon as she had enough information to be useful. But this one was different in nature from a supply dispute or a legal proceeding. This one required her to consider what she actually wanted and what she was willing to do or not do, and those were questions that didn't have operational answers. The rumors were designed to accomplish 2 things: to damage her reputation in a way that made her liability to Barrett rather than an asset, and to create a wedge between them by implication. The suggestion that her position at the ranch was based on something other than her competence. It was a specific kind of attack, targeted at the specific vulnerability of a woman in her position, and the fact that it was calculated made her angry in a cold, clean way that was different from the hot anger she'd felt when Rourke had let her go. That anger had been about unfairness. This one was about deliberateness. She told Barrett on a Tuesday evening when he came to the office as he usually did. She told him plainly, including where she'd heard it and when, and she watched his face while she did. His expression went through something she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled anger of the boundary dispute, but something harder and less managed. His jaw set, and his eyes went flat in a way that was different from his usual flatness, more like something under pressure. When she was finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How long have you known?" he said. 2 days. "Why did you wait?" "Because I needed to decide what I wanted to say about it before I said it." She looked at him directly. "I don't intend to leave because of rumors. If you want me to leave because of the effect they might have on the ranch's standing in the community, I understand that, and we can discuss it like adults. But I'm not going to make that decision for you based on what Granger's men are saying in the dry goods store." He held her gaze. "I don't want you to leave." "All right. I want to be clear that I don't want you to leave, and that the reason I don't want you to leave has nothing to do with what people in Crestfall are saying." His voice was even, but the evenness was something he was maintaining. She could hear the effort in it. "You have done more for this ranch in 4 months than—" He stopped. "You know what you've done. I don't need to list it." "You don't," she agreed. "Granger is trying to make you a liability because he can't touch the ranch any other way." He stood up, which he didn't usually do in the middle of a conversation, and moved to the window. "I'm going to address it." "How?" "Directly." He turned back. "I'm going to make it clear to every merchant and rancher and person with ears in this territory what your position is and what you've done in it, starting with the legal proceedings, because that's a matter of county record." He paused. "With your permission." She looked at him. The lamp between them made his face clearer than daylight sometimes did, fewer shadows to hide in. "You don't need my permission to speak about a public legal proceeding. I need your permission to speak about you," he said, and the directness of it landed in a way she wasn't entirely prepared for. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Yes." He nodded. He didn't move from the window right away, and she didn't tell him to. The night was quiet outside, and the ranch was dark except for the few lights still burning in the bunkhouse, and the lamp between them cast its small, reliable circle. The morning after she told Barrett about the rumors, he rode to Crestfall. She didn't go with him. She had work at the ranch, and he hadn't asked her to come, and she understood that what he was going to do was something he needed to do as himself, not as the man she stood beside. She watched him ride out from the office window, and then went back to the supply ledgers and let him go. He was back by afternoon. He didn't report to her, which she hadn't expected him to. But Tully, who had his own information network in the county, told her 2 days later that Barrett had visited the Ranching Association meeting in Crestfall, a meeting he hadn't attended in over a year, and had spoken plainly about the Granger boundary case, about Evelyn's role in it, and about the nature of the rumors circulating in town. Tully delivered this information with the compressed satisfaction of a man who approved. "What did he say exactly?" she asked, not because she needed to know, but because she was human. "He said you saved the Northeast section," Tully said. "He said you found the records no one else found and you rode to Millhaven in January to get them. He said the ranch won because of you." A pause. "He also said anyone who wanted to talk about what's going on at Blackstone Ranch could come out and see for themselves, and he'd be happy to show them." She was quiet for a moment. "And?" she said, because Tully had the expression of a man who hadn't gotten to the important part yet. "And he said you were the best ranch manager in the territory." Tully said it with the blunt simplicity of a man reporting a fact. He wasn't shy about it. She looked at the fence post she'd been inspecting and didn't say anything for a moment. "Go check on the north water line," she said. "It's fine." "Then go check on it again." He went, with the particular walk of a man suppressing amusement. The unexpected thing arrived on a Friday, 2.5 weeks after the ruling, in the form of a man she'd never met who rode up to the ranch in the late morning and asked for her specifically. He was well-dressed, around 50, and he introduced himself as Raymond Corfield, which was a name she didn't recognize, and said he had a message he'd been asked to deliver in person. She brought him to the office and waited. Corfield reached into his coat and produced a letter which he set on the desk. "From Mr. Granger," he said. "He asked me to deliver it personally and to wait for your response." She looked at Corfield, then at the letter, then at Corfield again. She opened the letter. It was written in a different hand than the legal correspondence. More personal, less formal, which she suspected was deliberate. Granger wrote that he had considerable respect for the work she'd done at Blackstone Ranch, that it was evident she was a woman of unusual capability, and that he was prepared to offer her a position managing his northern operation at a salary that was, and here he named a figure, nearly 3 times what she currently earned. The letter was smooth and courteous and confident in the way that letters were written by men who had rarely been told no. She read it once. She set it down. She looked at Corfield. "Tell Mr. Granger thank you for the offer," she said. "And no." Corfield blinked. "He was expecting you might want time to consider." "I don't need time." She met Corfield's eyes with the same straightforwardness she'd used on Barrett 4 months ago in this same room. "The answer is no. The salary he's offering—" "I heard the salary." She folded the letter and set it in front of him. "I'm not interested. You can take that back to him as plainly as I've said it." Corfield looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. He picked up the letter. "He won't be pleased." "I expect not." She stood, which concluded the meeting. "Thank you for making the ride." He left, and she went to the office doorway and watched him mount and ride back down the lane. And she felt nothing in particular, not triumph, not righteousness, nothing so clean as that. Just the settled certainty of a decision that didn't require examination because it had never actually been in question. Barrett found out that afternoon. She told him, the same way she'd told him about the rumors, directly, including the figure Granger had offered, because she thought he should know all of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's more than 3 times what I pay you." "Yes." "And you said no." "Yes." He looked at her with the particular quality of attention she knew by now. Not surprise exactly, but something that was taking in more than the surface of the situation. "Why?" She considered the question because it deserved a real answer, not a quick one. "Because money's not the point," she said. "It's never been the point. The point is the work, and whether the work means something." She looked at him steadily. This work means something. His wouldn't, no matter what he paid. Barrett held her gaze for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the office window at a low angle, the way it did in February, and it made the room feel closer than usual, more interior. "I need to raise your salary," he said. "You don't—" "I know I don't have to." His voice was quiet but firm. "I want to. What Granger offered tells me I've been underpaying you for months. That's not something I'm comfortable with." She thought about saying it didn't matter and then decided that was dishonest, because it did matter in the practical way that fair wages always mattered. "All right," she said. He named a figure. It was significantly higher than her current wage, and it was fair, genuinely fair, without being either generous as a performance or insufficient as an oversight. Just the correct number for the work she did and had been doing. "That's right," she said. "Good." He looked like he wanted to say something else and was deciding whether to. Then he said, "I want you to know that what Granger offered has no bearing on what I'm doing. I'm not matching him. I'm correcting what I should have corrected earlier." "I know," she said, "and the reason you're worth what I'm paying you has nothing to do with what you found for the legal case." He said it carefully, like a man who had been turning a sentence over and wanted to get it right. "It has to do with what you've done for this place. All of it. The hay inventory, and the kitchen garden, and the creek crossing, and 60 cattle in a rainstorm." He paused. "And the fact that you're still here." She looked at him in the February afternoon light, and she thought about what she'd said to him once, that she'd moved enough, that she wanted to be somewhere long enough for the work to mean something. And she felt the truth of that in her chest with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her with the unguarded expression she'd started seeing more of in recent weeks. The one without the professional distance, the one that was just him, the man behind the operation, and the reputation and the grief he'd been carrying since Eleanor. "Good," he said quietly, the same word he'd said when she'd agreed to the salary, but with a completely different weight behind it. She picked up the supply ledger she'd been working on before Corfield arrived, and she turned back to the desk, and he stayed in the chair across from her for a while. Not working on anything in particular, just present in the room with her, and the afternoon light moved across the floor and the windmill turned in the yard outside, and the ranch went on doing what it did, steadily, around them both. February moved into March the way seasons moved in that territory. Not cleanly, not on schedule, but in fits and reversals. A warm week followed by a hard frost, the ground thawing and refreezing until it didn't know what it was supposed to be. The kitchen garden showed the first green in the third week of March, small and tentative, pushing up through soil that Evelyn had spent 2 months amending. She saw it on a Monday morning from her window and didn't say anything about it to anyone, but she stood there for an extra minute before going downstairs. The ranch had settled into what she was beginning to understand was its proper rhythm, not the rhythm it had been running on when she arrived, which had been a diminished thing, efficient in some ways, but missing something essential, like a clock that kept time but had lost its chime. This was fuller. The men worked with a different quality of attention. The books were clean. The animals were in good condition going into spring, which was the real measure of a winter well managed. Granger had been quiet since Corfield's visit. That quiet had its own texture. Not the quiet of a man who had given up, but the quiet of one who was deciding his next move. She knew it because she'd been watching the territory the way she watched weather, looking for the signs that preceded the event. The feed suppliers, who'd considered switching allegiances, had mostly stayed, with the exception of a dry goods dealer in the South County who had quietly ended their arrangement in January. She'd replaced him within 2 weeks with a supplier out of Millhaven who charged slightly more but delivered reliably. The numbers absorbed it, but Granger's quiet continued past the point she expected, and the extended silence began to feel deliberate in a way that made her pay attention. She found out what it meant on a Wednesday in early April, when a rancher named Delbert Morse rode over from his property to the east. A small operation, a few hundred head, a man who'd been ranching the same land since before Barrett had expanded Blackstone to its current size. Morse was not a man who made social visits. He came to the office where Evelyn was working, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone bringing news they weren't sure how to carry. She told him to sit down, and he did. "Granger's been talking to the Ranching Association," he said. "Not the Crestfall chapter, the territorial one. He's put forward a petition to revisit the county hearing ruling on the grounds that new survey evidence has come to light. She looked at him steadily. What new evidence? He's hired a surveying firm out of the capital. They've apparently done a fresh survey of the boundary region, and they're claiming their measurements support the Acker document. Morse turned his hat in his hands. The petition's asking the Territorial Land Commissioner to review the county ruling. She sat with this for a moment, not with panic. Panic was not useful, and she'd learned that young, but with the particular focused stillness of someone cataloging what they were looking at. A territorial review was a different mechanism from a county hearing. It moved slower. It involved different officials, and a firm from the capital carried a kind of institutional weight that George Rutherford's family business, however authoritative, might not match in that arena. When was the petition filed? She said. Last week. Word travels slow. Morse looked at his hat. I came because you helped me last fall when the Henderson delivery was short. You told me how to document it, and I got the correction. He paused. I thought you should know. I appreciate it, she said, and she meant it. Thank you, Delbert. He left, and she sat for 5 minutes doing nothing but thinking, which was unusual for her, and which she allowed because sometimes the thinking before the action was the most important part. Then she went to find Barrett. He was in the north paddock, which was where he spent mornings when the operational work allowed him to be outside instead of behind a desk. He still preferred the physical work to the administrative work, and she'd never tried to change that because the ranch benefited from a man who knew his animals firsthand. She told him what Morse had reported, standing at the paddock fence, and she watched his face do the thing it did. The controlled hardening, the jaw setting, and then watched something else come through it, something newer than that, something that looked more like resolve than anger. A capital surveying firm, he said, with institutional credentials. The Territorial Land Commissioner is a different audience than Judge Caldwell. Can they overturn Caldwell's ruling? Not directly. But they can create enough procedural uncertainty to keep the boundary in question, which serves Granger's purpose almost as well as winning would. She looked at him. A disputed boundary means no clear water rights. No clear water rights means uncertainty on our financing, because the bank uses land assessment as collateral. If the northeast section is technically under challenge, the valuation changes. He was quiet. She could see him working through it. He's not trying to win the boundary anymore, he said slowly. He's trying to keep it unsettled. Yes, an unresolved dispute is almost as useful to him as a resolved one in his favor. It creates enough uncertainty to make operating difficult without having to prove his claim. She pulled her coat tighter against the April wind, which still had winter in it. We need to get ahead of this before the Territorial Commissioner's office takes it seriously. That means responding to the petition formally, and it means our evidence needs to be stronger than it was in the county hearing, because the audience is less familiar with local land history. Rutherford, he said. Rutherford, yes, and the state archives. Marsh requested the original territorial survey records months ago. I want to know if that request produced anything. She'd been meaning to follow up and had gotten occupied with the winter operations. She felt the edge of that, the small accountability of having let it sit. I'll ride to Crestfall today and talk to Marsh. Barrett turned from the paddock fence and looked at her with the expression she knew was his version of something he'd otherwise have said out loud. You don't have to do all of it yourself. I know. She said it honestly. But I'm better at this particular part than Marsh is, and we don't have time for things to be done less than well. He held her gaze. Come get me before you ride. I'm coming with you. She looked at him. In the early months, she would have argued, would have said it wasn't necessary, that she had it handled. She didn't argue now because she'd figured out that there was a difference between not needing help and not accepting it, and the second one was sometimes just stubbornness in more respectable clothing. Half an hour, she said. Marsh had received a response from the state archives. She discovered this when she arrived in his office and he produced a letter with the slightly guilty expression of a man who had been meaning to send word and hadn't gotten to it. She didn't comment on that. She read the letter. The state archives had located the original 1847 survey documentation. Not a copy, the original, with the official territorial seal and the principal surveyor's signature, filed in the capital at the time of the survey and untouched since. The archives were prepared to provide a certified copy, and upon formal legal request, the original could be subpoenaed for official proceedings. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down. "This is what we needed 6 months ago," she said, keeping her voice neutral. Marsh had the grace to look uncomfortable. "The archives take time. I understand that." She did. She just wished time had moved differently. "We need to file the formal request today, and we need to request the original for the territorial proceedings, not just a certified copy. A copy, even certified, gives Granger's attorneys something to argue about. The original gives them nothing." She looked at Marsh. "Can you file today?" "I can file today," he said. Barrett, who had been sitting to her left and had said very little since they arrived, said, "Do it." The next 6 weeks were the most sustained pressure she'd felt since arriving at Blackstone Ranch. It wasn't the concentrated urgency of the December storm, which had been brutal but brief. It was a different kind of difficult. The grinding, bureaucratic difficulty of a legal challenge that moved slowly and required constant attention to prevent it from drifting in the wrong direction. She tracked the petition's progress through the Territorial Commissioner's office, followed up on the State Archives request every 10 days, coordinated with Marsh on the formal response filing, and kept the ranch running through all of it because the operational work didn't pause for legal proceedings. She was tired in a way she hadn't been since the early weeks at Rourke's, when she'd been young enough not to know she was taking on too much. The difference now was that she knew it and did it anyway, because the situation required it, and she was not someone who put a problem down because it was heavy. Barrett saw it. She knew he saw it because he started doing something he hadn't done before. Appearing in the office with the second coffee pot already in hand, not asking if she wanted any, just refilling her mug and going back to whatever he'd been doing. It was a small thing, and she didn't comment on it. But she noticed it the way she noticed most things he did, which was completely. The State Archives produced the original survey documentation in the 5th week. Marsh received it and sent word immediately, and she rode to Crestfall the same day. She sat in Marsh's office with the document in front of her, the original, on heavy paper that had gone amber with age, with the territorial seal pressed into it and the principal surveyor's signature in ink that had faded to brown. And she read the northeast boundary notation for the first time in its original form, clear and unambiguous, the handwriting firm. The boundary was the ridge line, exactly where the fence stood, exactly where the iron stake was driven. She looked up at Marsh. "File everything," she said. "Today? The original survey, Rutherford's affidavit, the field notebook, the licensing documentation on Acker, all of it. We submit the complete record to the Territorial Commissioner's office, and we make it impossible for Granger's petition to go anywhere. The capital surveying firm's report cannot contradict an original territorial document. Whatever their measurements say, a fresh survey conducted in 1884 does not supersede a survey filed with the territorial government in 1847 and held in the state archives since." She looked at Marsh steadily. "We have the original. That's the end of it, legally. File today." He filed that afternoon. The Territorial Commissioner's office issued its decision 3 weeks later. The petition was denied. The county ruling was upheld. The boundary of Blackstone Ranch at the northeast section was confirmed, on the record, at the territorial level, citing the original 1847 survey as authoritative documentation. She read the decision at the kitchen table, which was where Mrs. Aldridge had brought it to her along with a cup of coffee, and no comment, because the housekeeper had developed an excellent sense of what situations required words and what they didn't. She read it once and then sat with it for a moment. The thing she felt was not triumphant. She'd expected to feel triumphant. She'd been working toward this for months, and she was human. She wanted the satisfaction. What she actually felt was quieter than that, more like the feeling of putting a heavy thing down after carrying it for a long time. Not elation, just the absence of the weight. She found Barrett in the office and told him. He read the decision himself, standing at the desk, and when he finished, he set it down with the careful precision of someone handling something they didn't want to crumple. "It's done," he said. "It's done." He looked at her across the desk. The morning light was coming through the east window, the spring light that was different from winter light, softer, more honest, less brutal. She'd lived through enough winters in enough places to know that spring light was not kind exactly, but it was real in a way that the harsh winter glare wasn't. You could see things in it. "I want to ask you something," he said. The change in his register was immediate, and she felt it, though she kept her face neutral. He didn't usually preface things. He usually just said them. "All right," she said. He moved around the desk, which he'd never done before in quite this way. Not to look at her work, not to show her something, but just to be on the same side of the desk as she was, standing a few feet away. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and his expression had the quality she'd seen that evening at the paddock gate in December, and had been cataloging quietly ever since. The unguarded quality, the one that showed up when he was saying something real. "When I hired you," he said, "I hired you because the ranch needed someone who could do the work. And you've done the work. More than I expected, more than I had any right to ask." He paused. "But somewhere in the last 5 months, what you are to me stopped being about the ranch." She looked at him. She didn't look away, and she didn't fill the silence. "I'm not good at this kind of conversation," he said. "You know that." "I know that," she said. "I'm going to say it badly. Say it anyway." He looked at her with the directness that was his most essential quality. The same directness that had made him seem formidable the first day she sat across from his desk, and that she understood now was not formidability, but simply honesty, the refusal to approach things sideways. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as my ranch manager, as my wife, if that's something you'd want." The room was very quiet. Outside, the windmill turned, and somewhere in the yard a horse moved, and a man's voice carried from the direction of the barn. The ranch went on being the ranch, indifferent to the moment happening inside the office. She thought about what she wanted to say and whether she had it yet. She was not someone who spoke before she was ready. The truth was that she had known this was coming. Not the words, not the moment, but the direction. She was not naive about herself or about him, and she'd watched the thing between them move from professional regard to something else over 5 months in the way that real things moved, which was slowly and without announcement, and with no single moment you could point to and say that was when it changed. She'd been carrying it the way she carried things that didn't have a practical category, carefully, in the part of herself she didn't look at too directly. But she looked at it now because the moment required it. She thought about what marriage meant in practical terms, which were the terms she trusted. It meant this ranch was her home in a way that went beyond the East Wing and the office and the work she'd built here. It meant Cole Barrett's life was bound to hers in a way that had nothing to do with supply ledgers and legal proceedings. It meant choosing something not because it was the available option, but because it was what she actually wanted. She wanted it. That was the simple fact under everything else. "I'm going to tell you something first," she said. He waited. "I don't do things halfway. You know that about me." She held his eyes. "If I marry you, I'm not managing your ranch and living in your house. I'm in this, the whole thing. That means the decisions matter to me personally, not just professionally. That means when I think you're wrong about something, I'll tell you, and I'll tell you directly, and that's not going to change because there's a different word for our relationship." "I know that," he said. "And I'm not Eleanor," she said more quietly. "I don't want to be, and I wouldn't be, and I don't think you're asking me to be. But I want to say it plainly." Something in his face moved. Not pain, not the old locked grief, but acknowledgement. "I know you're not Eleanor." He said it without heaviness. "I'm not asking for what was. I'm asking for what's here." She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had sat across from her in this room every evening for 5 months. The man who had backed her up without being asked and refilled her coffee without comment, and stood at a frozen paddock gate in December saying things he hadn't planned to say. The man who was, she had come to understand, genuinely good in the way that was harder than it looked. Not effortlessly good, not good without cost, but good because he'd decided to be and held to it even when it was inconvenient. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. Just one, small and controlled, but she heard it and understood that he'd been holding something, and now wasn't. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. It was not a dramatic conclusion. There was no particular ceremony to the moment. They were standing in the ranch office in the morning light with a legal ruling on the desk between them and the sound of the windmill coming through the window. He reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the desk, and she turned her hand and held his, and they stood like that for a moment that was brief and sufficient. Then she said, "Tully's going to find out before noon." He made the sound that was his version of a laugh. Short, real, slightly reluctant. "Tully already suspects." "Tully has suspected since January," she said. "Since before that," he said, and she looked at him. How long before that? Since the storm. He came and told me you'd moved 60 cattle in the dark, and then he looked at me in a way that I did not appreciate at the time. He picked up the territorial commissioner's ruling and moved it to the filing cabinet with the careful deliberateness of a man putting something important away properly. He's been annoyingly observant for 30 years. He's a good man, she said. He is, Barrett agreed. She went to the door and then she stopped. One more thing. He looked at her. The kitchen garden. I want to put in tomatoes this year. The beds are ready for it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd stopped trying to categorize. Then put in tomatoes, he said. She nodded and went out into the April morning. The weeks that followed had their own complications, because life in the territory didn't pause for personal arrangements. There was the spring cattle work, calving season, which was demanding regardless of what else was happening, the sleepless nights and early mornings that came with the territory every year. There was the continued supplier management, the relationship repairs from Granger's pressure campaign, the fence line work that had to be done before the spring grass made it harder to access. She worked through all of it with the same attention she'd always brought, because the work was still the work. But there was also the quieter business of two people figuring out how to be something new to each other, which was not something either of them was experienced at. Barrett was better at it than she'd expected, and she told him so once, which made him look at her with the sideways expression of a man who wasn't sure if he'd been complimented. I've had time to think about what I was doing wrong, he said, which was his version of an explanation. Eleanor? She said. I withdrew, he said, flatly, without drama. I knew I was doing it, and I kept doing it. It was easier. He paused. It's not easier. It's just more familiar. She looked at him across the dinner table. They'd started eating in the dining room instead of separately, which Mrs. Aldridge had received with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been setting two places and covering one for 2 years. You're not doing it now. I'm trying not to. That's enough, she said. Trying is what people do. Nobody does it perfectly. He looked at her. You're better at this than I am. I'm better at talking about it, she said. That's not the same thing. He thought about that. What are you not good at? She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she considered things. Asking for help, she said. I know when I need it. I'm slow to ask. She looked at her plate. I did everything at Rourke's alone because asking felt like admitting I couldn't manage. I did the same thing here, early on. The supplier review, the Granger records. I should have brought you in sooner on some of it. You didn't trust me yet, he said. I didn't know yet whether you'd let me work, she said, which was the more accurate thing. There's a difference between a man who trusts you and a man who lets you work. I needed to know which one you were before I could ask for anything. He looked at her steadily. Which one am I? Both, she said, which is rarer than it should be. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I didn't know I was until you were here. They married in May in the practical manner of people who didn't see the point in a large production. Judge Caldwell, the same man who'd presided over the boundary hearing, performed the civil ceremony in his office in Crestfall on a Tuesday morning. Marsh was there because he happened to be in the building. Tully was there because Barrett had told him, and Tully had appeared at the ranch at first light without further invitation, wearing a clean shirt and the expression of a man who had known this was coming long enough to have prepared the shirt. Mrs. Aldridge was there because Evelyn had asked her the week before, quietly, and the housekeeper had said yes without making anything of it, and had shown up in a gray dress with a small bunch of spring flowers from the garden that Evelyn had not expected and that she held through the entire ceremony. Pete found out when they rode back to the ranch. He was at the paddock when they arrived, and he looked at the two of them dismounting and at Tully's expression and at the flowers that Evelyn was still carrying somewhat absently. And his face did the thing that young faces did when they caught up to a situation, the rapid recalibration, followed by the slightly too enthusiastic response. Congratulations, he said, with the earnestness of someone who meant it completely. Thank you, Pete, she said. Copper's due for his morning check. Right, he said, and went. And she heard him say something to Garrett near the barn that she didn't catch, and then a sound that might have been more than one person responding. She stood in the yard with the flowers still in her hand and looked at the ranch. The morning was warm, genuinely warm for the first time since October, and the spring grass was coming in on the south pasture in the pale green that meant good grazing ahead. The kitchen garden behind the house was showing real growth now. Not just the tentative first shoots of March, but the confident growth of established plants in soil that had been properly prepared. The fence lines were tight. The water channels were running clean. The east barn, reorganized twice now, held what it was supposed to hold and nothing she couldn't account for. Barrett came and stood beside her. He looked at the same yard she was looking at, the same spring morning. "Same ranch," she said. "Different ranch," he said. Both things were true. It was 11,000 acres of the same land it had always been, running the same cattle, employing mostly the same men. The windmill was the same windmill. The dark timber and stone of the main house were unchanged, but it had something it hadn't had, something she'd heard Mrs. Aldridge try to articulate once, when she'd said the house had warmth again, and something Tully had come close to when he'd called her sharp, meaning more by it than the word contained. She had spent 6 years moving from ranch to ranch, doing the work well, and then moving on, because the places weren't right, or the people weren't right, or she told herself that, which wasn't always the same thing. The truth she'd been slow to look at directly was that she'd kept moving because staying required something more than competence, and competence was the only thing she'd entirely trusted in herself. Belonging wasn't competence. It was the willingness to let a place matter enough that losing it would hurt. She'd avoided that for a long time, dressed the avoidance up in pragmatism, told herself that a woman who relied on any particular place was a woman setting herself up to lose it. And she wasn't wrong, exactly. Places could be lost. People could be lost. The Rourke Ranch had been lost. Eleanor Barrett had been lost. The iron stake in the northeast corner had almost been lost to a man who understood how to exploit grief and distraction, but the stake was still there. And the records had existed even when no one was looking at them. And the work she'd done here, in the feed barn, and the creek crossing, and the county hearing room, and 100 ordinary days between, had made something that was more solid than what she'd arrived to. She thought that was what belonging actually was. Not the absence of risk, but the decision to build something anyway. To put your name on a place and let it put its name on you and accept that this meant you had something to lose. She'd lost things before and survived them. She'd survive whatever came next, and so would this ranch, and so would the man standing beside her who had also survived things and was, she understood more clearly now, still in the process of deciding what came after surviving. That was what they had in common more than anything. Not capability, though they were both capable. Not stubbornness, though they were both stubborn. But the particular willingness to look at the hard thing and not flinch from it. She'd seen it in him from the first week, when he told her about Eleanor without making a story of it. Just a fact. She hoped he'd seen something similar in her. She thought he had. Granger made one final attempt in June. It came in the form of an offer to purchase the entire northeast section outright. Not the 40 contested acres, but all of Barrett's northeast land, framed in a letter through his attorneys as a business proposition, a fair market offer, motivated, the letter claimed, by a desire to resolve the long-standing tension between the two operations. The price named was actually fair, which was the most irritating thing about it, because it meant Granger had done his homework and knew that a lowball offer would be insulting enough to refuse easily. She and Barrett sat with the letter in the office and talked about it for 2 hours, which was longer than they talked about most things, because it deserved that. She laid out the practical arguments on both sides without weighting them, because this was the kind of decision that had to be his, and she wasn't going to push it in a direction. "The northeast section is our best grazing land," she said. "Selling it solves the immediate tension with Granger, but changes the character of the operation permanently. We'd have to restructure the winter rotation, the water access is affected." "I know what we'd lose," he said. She waited. "I also know why he wants it," he said. "Not the land, the watershed." He looked at the letter. "If I sell him the northeast section, I'm not just selling 40 acres or 400 acres. I'm telling every rancher in this territory that if you push hard enough, Barrett eventually moves." She held his gaze. "That matters to you." "It matters," he said, "not because of pride, because of what's true." He paused. "I'm not moving." She nodded. "Then we write back." She drafted the refusal herself because she was better at precise language than he was, and they both knew it. She kept it brief and courteous and completely unambiguous. The northeast section of Blackstone Ranch was not for sale. They wished Mr. Granger's operation every success. He read it, changed one word, and signed it. She sent it with the afternoon post. After that, Granger was quiet in a different way. the quiet of a man who had tried every available avenue and found them all blocked. She didn't expect it to be permanent. A man with his resources and his particular character didn't stop wanting what he wanted. But she'd been in this territory long enough to know that some fights resolved not because someone won decisively, but because the cost of continuing outweighed what was left to gain. The original records were now on file at the territorial level. The boundary was confirmed at every available level of jurisdiction. There was nothing left to challenge without inventing something new from whole cloth, and even Granger's attorneys had limits. Summer came on hard and fast, the way summer did in that country, and the ranch moved into the cycle of it. The full herd on the expanded rotation she'd designed the previous winter, the water channels running strong through June, the kitchen garden producing more than the kitchen could use, which meant that the surplus went to the bunkhouse, and eventually Mrs. Aldridge began trading some of it with the neighboring Morse family for their surplus honey, a small economy that had the quality of something that had existed for years. She walked the northeast fence line in July, because she walked it every 2 months and had since the first time she and Barrett had ridden it in the January cold looking for an iron stake. The land was different in summer. The ridge was dry grass and pale rock, the sky enormous and relentless. She found the corner post and walked the 20 feet to the iron stake and crouched and cleared the summer grass from around it, and it was there as it had always been, solid in the earth that had held it for nearly 40 years. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment. There was a thing she'd understood about this work over 6 years, and now beyond 6 years, that she hadn't been able to articulate until recently. The thing was this: the ground held what was put into it, not always perfectly, not without effort to maintain it. But the iron stake was in the ground because a man in 1847 had done his job carefully and driven it deep enough and positioned it correctly, and that act of professional care had survived 4 decades and a legal challenge, and a man with enough money to make trouble, and a winter that froze the water tank solid. The work done well was still there, underneath everything, when you went looking for it. She thought you could say the same about most things that lasted. She stood up and brushed the dry grass off her knees and looked out over the northeast pasture, where the cattle were moving slowly through the summer heat, the way cattle did, without urgency, without complaint, just steadily existing in the place they were. 11,000 acres of it, running to the ridge line and no further, exactly as it should be. She turned her horse back toward home. Barrett was in the yard when she rode in, talking to Tully about something that involved the South Water situation, which had a minor issue she'd flagged last week and was apparently being resolved. He looked up when she came through the gate, and he raised one hand slightly. Not a wave exactly, just acknowledgement, the particular shorthand of people who had learned each other's language. She dismounted and handed the horse to Pete and crossed the yard, and the kitchen garden was green and growing along the back of the house, and the windmill was turning in the afternoon heat, and Mrs. Aldridge appeared at the kitchen door and called something about supper that neither of them answered immediately because they were both doing other things. It was not a perfect life. The water issue in the south section was going to take a week of work to properly fix. The fall cattle prices were uncertain because of a drought 2 territories east that was affecting the market. Barrett still sometimes went quiet for stretches that had nothing to do with anything she'd done, and everything to do with the losses he'd carried before she arrived. And she'd learned to let those stretches be what they were rather than try to resolve them. Because some things didn't resolve, they just became more familiar and therefore less heavy. She still had mornings where she woke up already calculating what needed to be done and feeling behind before the day had started. And she still had the habit of carrying more than she should alone before she remembered to say so. They were imperfect people running a complicated operation in a hard country, and they would be doing it for the foreseeable future. And the foreseeable future held the same mixture of good seasons and bad seasons and problems that had practical solutions and problems that didn't that all futures held. But the land was whole. The boundary was confirmed, the records were filed, and the stake was in the ground. The fence line was tight, and the cattle were healthy, and the kitchen garden was producing tomatoes for the first time in 2 years, which Mrs. Aldridge had told her, with unusual directness, made the house smell like it used to. She thought that was what she'd been building toward, through all of it. Not the legal victory or the salary or even the marriage, but this, a place that was real enough to lose and worth keeping anyway. The understanding that you didn't build something permanent by protecting yourself from caring about it. You built it by going all in and doing the work every day and trusting that what was put in with care was still there, underneath, when it mattered. She'd moved enough. This was where she stayed. The evening came on in long golden increments, and the ranch settled into the quiet of the end of a working day. And from somewhere in the direction of the bunkhouse, Tully's voice carried across the yard saying something to Pete that she couldn't make out, but that made Pete laugh. A young man's laugh, unguarded and real. Barrett came and stood beside her on the porch, and the sky went every color it knew how to be. And neither of them said anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. The windmill turned. The land held. That was enough.